I have evidence to clear his name, Annie shouted. Her voice cut across Bennett Grand Hall, small but steady, stopping the two security guards who had just moved toward Richard Bennett. Annie Carter stood at the edge of the red carpet in a faded blue dress and an oversized winter coat, one hand raised above her head. Between her fingers was a silver USB drive. "Let him go," she said. "He didn't do it, Mr. Richard is innocent." Richard Bennett turned from the stage for a moment. The tired lines in his face softened. He knew that child. He knew the yellow ribbons in her braids, the careful way she stood, the little coat her mother kept mending at the cuffs. Then he lifted one hand, palm low, gently signaling for Annie to stop. "Annie," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Go back to your mother. This place isn't right for you." Annie shook her head. "Go on now," Richard said. "You shouldn't be in the middle of this." "I'm not leaving," Annie answered. A guard stepped closer to guide her back, but Annie held the USB tighter and stood where she was. Richard's eyes narrowed with worry. "Annie, listen to me. These are grown-up matters." "No," she said. "They're telling lies about you. Your mother needs you safe. She needs you safe, too," Annie said. That answer reached him before he could hide from it. Annie took one small step forward. "You helped us when nobody did. Now I'm going to help you until the end." Richard did not answer. He looked at Grace Carter, Annie's mother, standing near the service entrance in her gray cleaning uniform. Grace had one hand pressed against her chest, caught between the fear of losing everything and the knowledge that her daughter had never sounded more certain. Before anyone else could speak, Daniel Cross stormed down from the stage. His face had changed. The calm, careful assistant who always stood one step behind Richard Bennett was gone. In his place was a man fighting to regain control of a room that had slipped from his hands the moment a child raised a USB. "What is this?" Daniel snapped. "Who let her in here?" Grace moved toward Annie, but Daniel pointed at her before she could reach her daughter. "Mrs. Carter, take your child out of this ballroom right now." Grace stopped. "Mr. Cross," now Daniel said louder. "This is a private event. This is a formal board matter. Your daughter has no business interrupting it." Annie lifted the USB again. "But I saw you." Daniel turned sharply toward her. "You saw nothing, you understood. I saw you take Mr. Richard's papers. You were 6 years old. I still saw it." Daniel looked back at Grace. His voice was no longer polished. "Do you understand what your daughter is doing? She is interfering with an investigation involving stolen charity funds. Do you understand how serious that is?" Grace's face tightened, but she did not step away from Annie. "She is trying to explain. She is disrupting a lawful board proceeding," Daniel said, "and she is embarrassing herself, you and this company." Richard stepped forward. "Daniel, enough." "No, Richard," Daniel said, turning on him. "Not enough. Not tonight. You don't get to hide behind a child because the truth finally caught up with you." Richard's jaw tightened. "I am not hiding behind anyone." "Then tell her to leave." "I already did." "Then make her leave." Richard's voice dropped. "I won't have her dragged out." Daniel gave a hard, humorless laugh and faced the room. "This is exactly how he works. He wraps himself in charity. He surrounds himself with poor families, children, school programs, hospital visits, anything that makes him look untouchable. And now, when the documents are finally in front of us, he lets a janitor's little girl interrupt the entire room with some toy in her hand." Annie looked down at the USB, then back up. "It's not a toy." Daniel pointed toward the service entrance. "Grace, take her out." Grace reached Annie and placed one hand on her shoulder. "Baby, tell me exactly what happened." Daniel spoke over her. "There is nothing to tell." Grace did not look at him. Annie took a breath. "I was waiting for you upstairs. My crayons fell and I went near the door." Mr. Daniel was in the room with the long table. He took papers from the cabinet. He put them in a brown folder. Then he went to the back door. A man was there. "Mr. Daniel gave him the folder and said Mr. Richard would look like a thief after the party. Daniel's face went still only for a second. Then he stepped toward them. That is enough. Richard moved at the same time. Stay where you are. Daniel stopped, but his eyes stayed on the USB. That device could be stolen company property. It fell when you were leaving, Annie said. I picked it up. You had no right to touch it. I was going to give it back, she said. But then I saw you give the folder to the bad man. Victor Lang, Richard's longtime rival, stood near the front with a folder of documents and a lawyer beside him. Until then, he had allowed Daniel to do most of the speaking. Now he adjusted his cuff and spoke with cold patience. This is absurd. A billionaire caught with charity transfers is now hiding behind a janitor's child. Richard turned toward him. Say another word about her like that, and this room will see exactly what kind of man brought these papers. Victor's mouth tightened. Daniel seized the opening. The documents are clear. Mr. Bennett's signature is on the transfers. His approval code is attached. The foundation's money was moved out under his authority. Richard faced him. I never signed those papers. Daniel raised his voice. That is what greedy men say when records expose them. You built a public image on helping children, then treated their fund like your private account. The words landed hard. Several board members looked from Daniel to Richard, then to the screen where the transfer documents still accused him in neat rows. Richard took a step toward Daniel. You know those documents are false. Daniel pointed at the guards. Keep him here. Do not let him leave until the board secures the records. The guards hesitated. Daniel pushed harder. If he walks out now, files disappear. Phones disappear. Servers get wiped. We cannot give him time to bury what he has done. Annie moved around her mother's arm. He's the one lying. Daniel spun back toward her. Stop saying that. I saw you. You saw papers. You invented the rest. No, I didn't. Daniel looked at the nearest guard. Take the USB from her. Richard's voice cut through the room. No one touches her. Daniel glared at him. You are not in a position to give orders. I am still in a position to protect a child. You stole from a children's foundation. I did not. You let donors believe their money was going to sick children in school libraries, Daniel said. All the while, transfers were moving under your authorization. Annie's brow tightened as she stared at the documents on the screen, but he signs important things blue. The line stopped Richard. Daniel answered too quickly. That has nothing to do with this. Yes, it does, Annie said. Mr. Richard told me. Blue means promise. Daniel pointed at the USB. That device could contain edited footage. It could contain stolen files. It could have been planted by someone trying to save him. Helen Morris, the investigative reporter standing near the press line, stepped closer. She had been watching Daniel more than the screen. Then let's see what it contains, Helen said. No, Daniel said at once. Helen turned to him. No, it cannot be entered into this discussion without verification. You were comfortable entering those transfer papers without letting Mr. Bennett verify them. Daniel's mouth tightened. This is a board matter. It became more than that when you accused a man of stealing charitable funds in front of cameras, Helen said. Richard kept his eyes on Annie. Where did you get it? It fell when Mr. Daniel was leaving the room, Annie said. I picked it up. I was going to give it back, but then I saw him give the folder to the bad man. Daniel raised his hand toward the guards again. Keep Bennett away from the exits. And someone take that USB before it disappears. Nobody moved. The balance in the room changed. Daniel had been the first to demand Richard be held. Daniel had pushed the accusation harder than Victor. Daniel had ordered Grace to remove Annie. Daniel had tried to take the USB before anyone saw it. Helen stepped between Daniel and the child. Annie, she said, may I? Annie looked at Grace. Grace nodded once. Give it to Miss Morris. Annie placed the USB in Helen's palm. Daniel started forward. Richard said, Daniel. The assistant stopped. Richard's voice was low. If there is nothing on that drive, you have nothing to fear. Daniel looked at him with a coldness Richard had never seen before. You are making a mistake. No, Richard said. For 7 years I may have made one tonight. I am correcting it. Helen walked to the technician near the sound booth and handed him the USB. The technician looked at the board chair, then at Richard, then at Helen. Put it on the screen, Helen said. The transfer documents disappeared. The screen went black. Annie stood beside her mother, small and straight, her hands now empty. Richard remained at the foot of the stage. Victor Lang's lawyer leaned toward him, speaking quickly. Daniel Cross stared at the screen as if he could stop it by will alone. A file opened. The first frame showed the 12th floor conference room. After hours, Daniel Cross was standing by the cabinet with Richard Bennett's private contracts in his hand. The video did not begin with drama. It began with a hallway. The time stamp in the corner read 10:47 p.m. 3 nights before the gala. The 12th floor of Bennett Global Group looked different after hours. No assistants moved between desks. No phones rang. No one carried coffee or folders or small emergencies from one office to another. The long corridor sat under half-lit panels. Clean enough to reflect the ceiling lights. Quiet enough that every step on the video sounded too loud. On the screen, Daniel Cross entered from the elevator. He was alone. No one in the ballroom breathed loudly now. The same guests who had been ready to watch Richard Bennett removed from his own event sat frozen in their chairs, staring at the screen as Daniel walked down the hallway with his keycard in one hand and his phone in the other. Grace kept one arm around Annie's shoulders. Annie stood still, looking smaller now that her hands were empty. She was not looking at the screen. She was looking at Daniel. Richard saw that and felt something hard settle in his chest. A child had been afraid of a man he had trusted with his life's work. On the video, Daniel stopped outside the main conference room. He looked over his shoulder once. Then he swiped his card and stepped inside. Helen Morris moved closer to the technician. Turn up the sound if there is any. The technician adjusted the volume. At first, there was only the low hum of the building system. Then came the faint scrape of a drawer opening. The camera angle changed. The footage was not perfect. It came from the small security camera mounted near the conference room ceiling. A camera no one noticed unless they had once worked security or cleaned after midnight. Daniel crossed to the locked cabinet beside the presentation wall. He entered a code. Richard's voice came low. Only 3 people had that code. Daniel said nothing. On screen, Daniel removed a stack of folders. He laid them across the conference table and began sorting. One folder carried the Bennett Hope Foundation seal. Another showed contract tabs marked hospital, school district, donor pledge, private grant. Helen glanced at Richard. Are those current foundation files? Richard nodded once. Some of them were not supposed to leave legal review. Victor Lang's lawyer leaned toward him again, speaking into his ear. Victor did not move his eyes from the screen. The video continued. Daniel took out his phone and photographed page after page. He paused on signature pages. He placed them flat under the light. He zoomed in. He took several shots of Richard Bennett's signature. Annie tugged gently on her mother's sleeve. That's the part one saw, Mommy. Grace bent her head. I know, baby. Daniel finally spoke, his voice measured but tight. This proves I accessed documents I had authorization to handle. It proves nothing else. Helen answered without looking at him. Then you should be relieved. There's more. The files shifted. This part was lower quality. Probably from another camera. The screen showed the rear service corridor of the building. A row of gray doors lined one wall. Metal carts were parked near the freight elevator. At the far end was the back exit Grace used when her shift ended late. Daniel appeared carrying a brown folder beneath his coat. Annie stepped closer to Grace. That's the door, she said. That's where he went. Daniel's face tightened. This is being taken out of context. Richard looked at him. What context explains that? Daniel did not answer. A man entered the frame from outside. He wore a dark overcoat and a red scarf tucked at the collar. His face was partly turned away, but the logo on the car behind him was visible through the glass door. Langford Capital, Victor Lang's company. Helen spoke to the technician. Pause it. The image froze. She pointed to the car. That is not a coincidence. Victor Lang straightened. My company has cars all over Chicago. That proves nothing. Then you won't mind explaining why one of them was parked at Bennett Global's service exit 3 nights before you presented stolen documents. Victor's jaw moved once. I don't answer questions from reporters in the middle of stage theater. Helen gave him a dry look. You walked into the theater carrying the props. The room stayed silent. The technician resumed the video. Daniel handed the folder to the man in the red scarf. The man opened it briefly, checked the pages, then gave Daniel something small. It caught the light for a second. A drive, Helen said. Daniel's voice rose. You cannot authenticate that. Annie looked at him. You dropped the other one. Daniel looked down at her as if he had forgotten she was still there. She held Grace's hand and continued. You were in a hurry. It fell near the big plant by the elevator. I picked it up after you left. Richard turned toward Daniel. You knew she had it. Daniel gave a small bitter laugh. Richard, listen to yourself. You were taking business advice from a child who colors in hallways. She has been more honest tonight than you have been in 7 years. That struck harder than Richard intended. Daniel's face changed again, not with fear this time, but with anger that had been waiting for permission. You want honesty, Daniel said. Fine. You never saw the people standing beside you. You saw causes. You saw names on buildings. You saw hospital wings and scholarship dinners and photographs with children in new coats. But the people doing the work, we were furniture to you. Richard did not look away. So you sold my foundation files. I kept your empire moving. You betrayed it. I watched you get called generous for signing checks other people prepared. Richard's voice stayed even. And that made stealing from children acceptable to you. Daniel snapped. I didn't steal from children. No, Helen said, you helped frame a man for it. Daniel pointed toward the screen. The transfers still exist. The money moved. His signature is on the authorization. Annie lifted her head, but it's not the right color. Grace looked down at her. Annie, it isn't, Annie said. Mr. Richard signs important things blue. Daniel shut his eyes for half a second as if the sentence itself annoyed him. Richard remembered the afternoon at once. Annie sitting cross-legged in the corner of his office while Grace cleaned. A blue crayon in her hand. His fountain pen uncapped beside a stack of thank you letters. She had asked why his pen was blue. He had told her what his father told him. Blue ink showed what was real, and real promises should not hide inside black copies. He had forgotten the conversation. Annie had not. If Annie's courage touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video. Comment below and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about truth, justice, and the quiet heroes who change everything. Helen turned to the screen showing the transfer documents still minimized at the bottom of the system. Bring the wire transfers back up next to the video. The technician looked at the board chair who gave a reluctant nod. The screen split. On the left, Daniel handing the folder to the man outside. On the right, the alleged transfer approvals with Richard Bennett's signature printed in black. Helen pointed. Mr. Bennett, do you sign foundation disbursement approvals in black ink? No, Daniel spoke quickly. Scanned documents often appear black. Richard answered, not originals. Victor stepped forward. This is becoming childish. Annie turned to him. It's not childish if it's true. For the first time that night, a few people in the room seemed to remember she was 6 and still somehow braver than they had been. Helen asked Richard, can you produce original foundation documents signed in your standard ink? Yes, Richard said. My office has physical copies of every major grant authorization. They're kept in the executive archive. Daniel immediately said, no one should access those files without counsel present. Richard looked at the board chair. Then send counsel, send security, send Helen, send anyone you trust, but open the archive. The board chair hesitated. He was an older man named Paul Whitaker, retired from banking, careful in speech, and slower when frightened. He had been among the first to step away from Richard when Victor presented the documents. Now he looked ashamed of his own caution. "Send 2 board members," Paul said finally. "And building security. Retrieve the originals." Daniel's hands curled at his sides. "Paul, that is a mistake." Paul looked at him. "You've said that several times tonight, Daniel. I'm beginning to wonder who benefits when we don't look." That landed. 2 board members left with a security supervisor. The room remained in place, held by the split screen, betrayal on one side, accusation on the other. Grace guided Annie a step back from the center aisle, but Annie resisted leaving Richard's view. Richard noticed and gave her a small nod. Not the kind adults gave children to quiet them, but the kind one person gives another when courage has already been proven. Annie nodded back. Helen kept her recorder running. "Mr. Cross," she said, "while we wait, maybe you can explain why you tried to have the USB taken from Annie before anyone viewed it." Daniel looked at her. "I was protecting the integrity of the investigation, from evidence, from manipulation." Helen glanced at the screen. "You were recorded taking private contracts from a cabinet, handing them to a man connected to Victor Lang, and then trying to stop a child from showing the recording. That is a difficult kind of integrity to explain." Victor cut in. "My attorney will respond to any formal allegation." Richard looked at Victor. "You came here to ruin me in front of donors." Victor met his eyes. "You did that yourself." "No," Richard said. "Someone built a lie with my signature on it." The doors near the side aisle opened. The board members returned carrying a locked document case. The security supervisor set it on a table near the stage. Paul Whitaker unlocked it with the compliance officer standing beside him. One by one, they removed original grant approvals, Children's Hospital Equipment Fund, Southside Reading Rooms, Winter Meal Program, Nursing Scholarship Partnership. Every signature was blue. Not just blue, but deep blue with a small line under the B in Bennett. Helen looked at Annie. "Is that what you meant?" Annie nodded. "That's Mr. Richard's promise color." The technician zoomed in on the fake wire transfer. Black signature. No blue ink. No pressure mark. No small line under the B. The compliance officer leaned toward the document, then looked at Paul. "This is not an original signature. It's a scan placed into a transfer template." Daniel's face lost color. Richard did not celebrate. He simply closed his hand around the back of a chair as if the truth had arrived too late to keep him from feeling the fall. Annie looked up at her mother. "Did it help?" Grace bent down and kissed the top of her head. "Yes, baby, it helped." Across the room, Daniel Cross took one step backward. Helen saw it. So did Richard. "Security," Richard said. Daniel stopped moving. The video remained frozen behind him, showing his own hand passing Richard Bennett's papers through the back door. Security moved toward Daniel Cross. Not fast, not rough, but with the kind of certainty that told the room the center of power had shifted. Daniel lifted both hands slightly. "This is insane. You're going to treat me like a criminal because a child found a flash drive." Richard did not answer him right away. His eyes were still on the frozen video behind Daniel. On that small image of a brown folder passing from a trusted hand to a stranger at the service door, Richard had spent years signing checks, shaking hands, opening clinics, sitting with school principals who needed computers more than speeches. He had thought betrayal would announce itself with anger. Instead, it had worn a good tie and reminded him about meetings. Paul Whitaker, the board chair, stood beside the table where the original documents had been spread out. His voice was old but steady. "Mr. Cross, until counsel arrives, you will remain in this room." Daniel laughed once. "Paul, think carefully. I know every weakness in this foundation's filing system. I know every shortcut Richard approved. If you make me the villain tonight, I will not go quietly." Helen Morris turned her recorder toward him. That sounded close to a threat. It was a warning. To whom? Daniel looked at Richard. "To all of them." Victor Lang's lawyer touched Victor's sleeve and murmured something. Victor did not move. He was measuring the room, deciding which door could still open for him. The problem was simple. A few minutes earlier, He had walked in as the man exposing corruption. Now, the screen showed his company car at Bennett Global's service exit, and the assistant he had used was beginning to talk too much. Annie watched Daniel from beside her mother. She did not understand board politics or legal threats. She understood that Daniel sounded different now, less like the man who smiled at donors, more like the man she had heard through the conference room door. Grace felt the child's fingers tighten around hers. "Stay close," she said. "I am." Richard finally spoke. "Daniel, who else has copies?" Daniel's mouth closed. "The transfer templates, the signature scans, the donor contracts, who has them?" Daniel glanced toward Victor. It was small, too small for most people, but not for Helen, not for Richard, and not for Annie, who had learned in 6 short years that grown-ups often told the truth with their eyes before their mouths caught up. Victor stepped forward. "My attorney has already made clear that any further accusations should go through proper channels." Richard turned to him. "You brought false documents into my foundation gala." "I brought documents provided to my office by a concerned internal source." Daniel looked at him sharply. "Victor." Victor did not look back. If Mr. Cross acted outside the law, that is his responsibility. The room understood that sentence at once. Daniel understood it first. His face changed. Anger replaced fear. And for a moment, Richard saw the whole arrangement collapse in Daniel's eyes. The promise of money, the promise of a title, the promise that Victor Lang would protect the man who had opened the door from inside. Daniel said, "You said I wouldn't be left holding this." Victor's lawyer grabbed his arm. "Do not answer that." Helen stepped closer. "Mr. Cross, who said that?" Daniel stared at Victor. "He did." Victor snapped. "Careful." "No," Daniel said. "You be careful. You wanted Bennett ruined before the hospital contracts closed. You wanted the board panicked. You wanted donors pulling out by morning so Langford could step in with a rescue package." Richard's head lifted. Rescue package. Paul Whitaker looked sick. Victor's office contacted 2 board members last week. They offered emergency management support if the foundation experienced leadership instability. Helen's pen stopped moving for half a second. "That sounds prepared." Victor said. "That was contingency planning." Richard looked at him. "You planned my disgrace before your evidence appeared." Victor's face hardened. "You always thought being liked made you clean." "No," Richard said. "I thought helping children meant the money should reach children." Daniel gave a bitter smile. "Listen to him. Still performing." Annie stepped forward before Grace could stop her. "Mr. Daniel." The room turned to her again. Daniel looked down. "What? Why did you say he would look like a thief?" Grace put a hand on Annie's shoulder, but Annie did not move back. Her question had no polish, no legal language, no trap built by adults. It was plain enough to leave Daniel nowhere comfortable to stand. Daniel swallowed. "I don't owe you an explanation." "You said it," Annie answered. At the back door, Helen's voice softened, but she stayed sharp. "That line is on the recording, Mr. Cross. You may want to answer before someone else answers for you." Daniel's shoulders dropped a fraction. "Not defeat. Calculation. I spent 7 years making Richard Bennett look good," he said. "Do you know what that feels like? Sitting outside every room while he gets thanked for the work you organized. Watching him play the moral man while everyone else cleans up the mess." Grace's expression changed at the word cleans. "You think cleaning is shameful." Daniel looked at her as if he had forgotten she was there. Grace continued, her voice controlled. "I clean offices after midnight. I clean coffee spills from carpets and fingerprints off glass doors. I clean up after men who don't know my name. That doesn't make me less than them. It means I do honest work." A few people lowered their eyes. Richard looked at Grace, and the shame that touched him then was not from the accusation on the screen. It came from realizing how much of his building ran on people he had thanked but never really known. Daniel sneered. "This is touching." "No," Grace said. "It's true." Annie looked up at her mother with pride. Then back at Daniel. "You said Mr. Richard was bad, but you were the one taking things." Daniel's mouth tightened. "Little girl, You have no idea what men like him take. Then show it, Richard said. Show one real document I signed taking foundation money. Daniel did not answer. The compliance officer, a woman named Marcia Bell, had been examining the papers since the originals came out. She adjusted her glasses and laid the fake transfer sheet beside a real grant approval. There's another problem. Hall turned to her. What is it? The approval code on the alleged transfer is formatted incorrectly. Bennett Foundation disbursement codes use the fiscal year program category and two initials from the approving officer. This one uses an old internal vendor format from Bennett Global, not the foundation. Richard frowned. Who would know both systems? Marca looked at Daniel, someone with access to both, but not enough experience in foundation compliance to know the difference mattered. Daniel said, that is speculation. It is documentation, Marcia replied. Helen moved beside the table. Can you say that again on record? Marcia looked at Paul. Then Richard nodded. Marcia spoke clearly. The transfer documents presented tonight do not match Bennett Hope Foundation's approval structure. The signatures appear scanned. The ink pattern is wrong and the authorization code format is inconsistent with foundation practice. Victor's lawyer said, my client objects to this public characterization. Helen looked at him. This isn't a courtroom. No, Richard said. It's the room where your client chose to accuse me. The side doors opened and two uniformed Chicago police officers entered with a hotel security manager. Behind them came a plain-clothes detective, a black woman in her late 40s with close-cropped hair and a tired, alert face. She showed her badge to the nearest guard. Detective Angela Reeves, she said. We received a call about possible fraud, stolen corporate records, and an active disturbance. Helen raised her hand slightly. Detective, I'm Helen Morris. I have video evidence already displayed and the original drive is in my possession. Daniel said that drive is company property. Detective Reeves looked at him. And you are Daniel Cross, executive assistant to Richard Bennett. Richard said, former executive assistant. Daniel turned toward him. You can't fire me in front of a ballroom. I just did. The detective stepped between them before Daniel could answer. Nobody is leaving with any device, document, laptop, or phone until I understand what happened. Victor's lawyer objected at once. My client is not a party to this internal employment dispute. Annie pointed at the screen. That's his car. Detective Reeves followed her finger. Whose car? Annie looked at Victor. The man with the gray hair. The one who said mean things. Victor stared at her. Detective Reeves looked from Annie to Grace. Ma'am, is this your daughter? Yes, Grace said. Her name is Annie Carter. The detective crouched just enough to meet Annie without towering over her. Annie, did you see something that belongs to this video? Annie nodded. Mr. Daniel gave a folder to the man by the door. Then he dropped the silver thing. The USB. Yes, ma'am. Grace gently corrected. Yes, detective. Annie repeated. Yes, detective. Reeves gave a small nod. The kind older adults used when they appreciated manners, but had no time to praise them. Good. Stay with your mother. She stood and addressed the room. I need the screen preserved as it is. I need the original USB bagged. I need copies of the transfer documents and the original foundation documents. Mr. Cross, please step away from the table. Daniel did not move. Am I under arrest? Not yet. Then I'm not moving. Detective Reeves held his eyes. You can make this harder if you want. Men often do. It rarely helps them. For the first time all night, Daniel obeyed without speaking. Richard looked toward Annie. She stood with one hand in Grace's and the other holding the edge of her coat. She had done what adults had failed to do. She had interrupted the lie before it became history. He walked over and stopped a few feet away, careful not to crowd her. Annie, he said, thank you. She looked at the police, then at Daniel, then back at him. Are they still taking you away? No, Richard said, not tonight. Good, she said, because Mommy said people should not get punished for things they didn't do. Grace closed her eyes briefly. Richard nodded. Your mother is right. Detective Reeves called for evidence bags. Helen Morris kept her recorder running. Paul Whitaker began gathering board members to formally suspend Daniel's access. Victor Lang stood with his lawyer, no longer commanding the room, only trying to survive it. On the screen, Daniel's frozen image remained beside the open cabinet, and beneath that image, the timestamp kept glowing. 10:47 p.m. 3 nights before the gala, the lie had entered through a back door. Tonight, a 6-year-old girl had carried it back into the light. Detective Angela Reeves did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Once she stepped into the center of Bennett Grand Hall, people began doing what she asked because her calm made refusal look foolish. "I want the ballroom doors held," she said to the hotel security manager. "No one deletes anything. No one touches the laptops. No one takes a phone call outside unless an officer is standing with them." Victor Lang's lawyer stepped in at once. "Detective, my client is not under arrest and he has rights." "He does." Reeves said he also has a company car on a video connected to a potential fraud complaint. "He can exercise his rights from that side of the room." Victor's mouth tightened. "This is outrageous. So is accusing a man of stealing from children with documents that may be forged." Reeves said, "We'll see which outrage survives the paperwork." "Well, unquoteku so unquote." J.D. Richard Bennett stood near the stage, no longer surrounded by guards, but not free of the night either. His name had not been fully cleared. The room had seen the video, the mismatched signatures, Daniel Cross by the cabinet, Daniel at the back door, but reputations did not heal as quickly as screens changed. A stain could spread in a second and take years to wash out. Grace Carter understood that better than most. She kept Annie close, one hand resting on the child's shoulder, while the other still held the folded cleaning towel she had forgotten to put down. Her work shift had turned into a public crisis. And although Richard had been kind to them, Grace knew kindness did not stop rent notices, lawsuits, or men with money from punishing the wrong people. Annie looked up at her. "Mommy, did I do bad?" Grace bent down. "No, baby, you told the truth. But Mr. Daniel is mad. People get mad when truth takes away their hiding place." Annie thought about that, then nodded as if filing it somewhere important. Detective Reeves came over with a small evidence bag in one hand. Helen Morris stood beside her, holding the USB by its edges with a napkin the technician had given her. "Mrs. Carter," Reeves said, "I need to ask Annie a few questions, but only with you. Right here. Nothing long." Grace straightened. "She's 6. I know. I'll keep it simple." Richard stepped back at once, giving them space. That small movement was not lost on Grace. Too many powerful men moved closer. When children were afraid, trying to own the moment. Richard moved away. Reeves crouched to Annie's level. "Annie, I'm going to ask about the silver drive. You found it upstairs." "Yes, detective." "Where exactly?" "By the big plant. The one near the elevator. It has white rocks in the pot." "What were you doing there?" "Waiting for Mommy. She was cleaning the room with the long table. My crayons fell and the blue one rolled near the door." Reeves nodded. "Did anyone tell you to pick up the USB?" "No." "Did anyone tell you to bring it tonight?" Annie shook her head. "I put it in my backpack. I forgot a little. Then they said Mr. Richard stole from kids. And I remembered Daniel Cross standing between two security officers," said from across the room. "That is not a chain of custody. Any first-year lawyer would tear that apart." Reeves did not even turn fully toward him. "Mr. Cross, if you interrupt a child witness again, I'll move you to the hallway in cuffs for obstruction while I sort out whether the cuffs should stay on." Daniel closed his mouth. Annie looked at Reeves. "What is chain?" Grace gave her shoulder a squeeze. "Not now, baby." Reeves allowed the smallest smile. "It means grown-ups like to make simple things sound heavy. You're doing fine." Helen Morris watched that exchange closely. She had seen children mishandled by systems built for adults. Reeves was careful and that mattered. Paul Whitaker approached Richard with 2 board members behind him. His face had gone from alarm to regret. "Richard, the board is convening an emergency session in the side room." We need to formally suspend Daniel's access and preserve all Foundation systems. Richard nodded. Do it. Paul hesitated. I owe you an apology. Not yet, Richard said. Paul looked wounded by that, but Richard did not soften it. Not because I don't want one, Richard continued. Because we are not done. The children's money matters more than my feelings tonight. Lock the accounts. Freeze every pending transfer. Pull outside counsel. Real outside counsel, not anyone Daniel selected. Paul nodded, agreed, and get Marcia whatever she needs. Marcia Bell, the compliance officer, had already taken command of the document table with the seriousness of a church treasurer counting offering money after Sunday service. She sorted originals from copies, marked the printed transfers, and asked the technician to preserve the projection files. Helen stepped toward Richard. Mr. Bennett, on record, when did you first suspect Daniel Cross? Richard looked at Daniel before answering. About 15 minutes ago. Helen did not flinch. You trusted him completely? Yes. Was that trust why he had access to both Foundation documents and corporate contract files? Richard took the hit without hiding. Yes. Do you accept responsibility for that access? Grace looked at Helen surprised by the sharpness of the question. But Richard answered before anyone could object. I accept responsibility for trusting the wrong man. I do not accept responsibility for stealing money I never touched. Helen nodded. Fair distinction. Victor Lang gave a short laugh, a convenient one. Richard turned toward him. You should save your voice for the detective. Victor's lawyer put a hand on his arm. Victor, stop speaking. That was the first sensible thing anyone from Victor's side had said all night. Reeves returned to the center of the room. Mr. Lang, I'll need the name of the employee assigned to the car in that video. My counsel will provide any relevant information. Good. Provide it before that car becomes harder to explain. Victor stared at her. Do you know who I am? Reeves looked tired for the first time, not afraid. Just tired in the way working adults get when rich men ask questions they already know the answer to. Yes, she said. That's why I'm speaking. Clearly. Annie watched Reeves with interest. Mommy. She talks like Grandma Ruth. Grace almost smiled. She does. Detective Reeves heard it. Grandma Ruth sounds like a smart woman. She says don't start mess. But don't run from it either. Annie said. That's good advice. Richard looked down at Annie. The child had returned the room to human size. A board crisis, a fraud attempt, a public accusation. All of it had bent around the simple fact that Annie Carter remembered what she saw and said it. Daniel saw Richard looking at her and scoffed. This is what you'll turn it into. Isn't it? A little girl saves the generous billionaire. Perfect headline. Helen's eyes moved to him. It is a better headline than trusted assistant sells charity files. Daniel looked at her with open dislike. You people love clean stories. No, Helen said. I love documented ones. Reeves held up the evidence bag. Miss Morris, place the USB inside. Helen did. Reeves sealed it and wrote the time across the label. The original stays with me. The hotel will preserve all camera footage from the last 7 days. Bennett Security will produce access logs for the 12th floor, service corridor, executive archive, and rear entrance. Mr. Bennett, can your IT team lock Mr. Cross out now? Richard looked at Paul. Paul answered, already in progress. Daniel's phone vibrated in his hand. Reeves noticed. Put it on the table. Daniel held it tighter. It's personal. It is evidence until I know it isn't. He did not move. Reeves took one step closer. Mr. Cross. For a moment, everyone in the ballroom saw the decision pass through him. Obey and lose control. Resist and confirm every suspicion. Daniel placed the phone on the table. An officer bagged it. Richard felt no pleasure watching it. That surprised him. He had imagined in other contexts that betrayal would produce rage clean enough to use. Instead, he felt older. He thought of every morning Daniel had handed him coffee, every late flight, every condolence note Daniel had drafted after a donor's spouse died. Every quiet "I'll handle it, sir." Richard had mistaken usefulness for loyalty. Grace, still beside Annie, understood that look. My mother used to say, she told him, some folks stand close so they can hold you up. Some stand close so they know where to cut. Richard turned to her. Your mother was right. Usually was. Annie tugged Grace's sleeve. Can we go home now? Grace looked at Reeves. The detective said, soon. I need your contact information and I'll need to speak with you tomorrow at the station or at your home, whichever is easier. With a child advocate present. Richard said they'll have transportation. Grace answered quickly. We can take the bus. No, Richard said, then caught himself. I'm sorry. I mean, the company can provide a car if you're comfortable with that. If not, I'll ask Detective Reeves to arrange something neutral. Grace studied him. Neutral is better tonight, Richard nodded. Then neutral. That answer mattered. Grace had spent too much of her life having help come with a hand on the back of her neck. She appreciated a man who could be corrected without making her pay for it. Across the room, Paul Whitaker returned from the side chamber. Daniel's access has been suspended. All outgoing Foundation transfers are frozen pending review. Marcia added, I found 2 more transfer drafts in the system. Unsigned. Same template. Richard looked at Daniel. How many were you planning? Daniel said nothing. Victor's lawyer closed his eyes for a moment, and that silence answered more than words. Helen moved closer to Reeves. Detective, do you want the press held? Reeves looked at the reporters near the back. I can't stop them from reporting what they saw. I can ask them not to publish the child's address, school, or identifying details beyond what her mother approves. Helen turned to the room. You heard her. One younger reporter started to object, then saw Grace's face and thought better of it. Richard stepped toward the podium. Paul began to stop him, but Richard raised a hand. I won't discuss evidence, Richard said. But these people came to support children, and they deserve to know the Foundation is not shutting down tonight. He faced the room. No notes, no prepared speech. The funds are frozen for review, not abandoned. Every school, clinic, and meal program promised support will receive an answer from this foundation in writing. Once Detective Reeves and independent counsel complete their work, if my name has been used in a lie, I will help uncover it. If my systems allowed that lie to grow, I will fix them. But no child loses a book, a coat, a meal, or a hospital bed because grown men decided to play dirty. No applause came at first. That was good. Applause would have been too easy. Then an older woman near the donor table stood. She had been one of the first to pull away from Richard earlier. Her name was Mrs. Evelyn Hart, a retired school principal who had spent 40 years in Chicago classrooms. She did not clap. She simply said, see that you do. Richard nodded. I will. Annie looked up at Grace. She sounds like Grandma Ruth, too. Grace whispered. That's because old school principals and grandmothers are cousins in the spirit. Annie accepted that. Detective Reeves gave final instructions. Daniel was escorted to a side room, not yet arrested, but no longer free to roam. Victor Lang remained with his lawyer under an officer's watch. The USB, phones, documents, and access logs were logged one by one. As the room began to break into controlled movement, Richard approached Annie and Grace once more. Annie, he said you were right to speak. Annie studied him even when you told me to go home. Especially then, Richard said, I was trying to protect you, but you were trying to protect the truth. She thought about that. Next time, maybe listen faster. Grace inhaled sharply. Annie. Richard laughed once, quiet and tired. The first real laugh he had managed all night. She's right. Grace shook her head, but there was warmth in it now. An officer came to escort them to a private waiting area. Annie took 2 steps, then turned back toward the screen. The image of Daniel at the cabinet still remained. Can they turn that off? She asked. Reeves looked at the technician. Preserve it, then turn off the display. The screen went dark. Only then did Annie let her shoulders relax. The lie had not ended. Not fully. There would be lawyers, interviews, statements, and men trying to save themselves by changing the shape of the truth. But the first door had closed behind it. And this time, Daniel Cross was on the wrong side. The private waiting room behind Bennett Grand Hall had beige walls, a round table, and a coffee machine that sounded tired each time someone pressed the button. It was not made for children, but someone from hotel staff found a carton of apple juice and a pack of peanut butter crackers. Annie accepted both with polite seriousness, then waited until Grace nodded before opening them. "You can eat, baby," Grace said. "You did enough standing tonight." Annie climbed into a chair that was too tall for her and set the crackers on a napkin. Her feet did not touch the floor. Outside the room, voices moved back and forth. Police, hotel security, board members, lawyers, people trying to sound calm after being wrong in public. Richard Bennett stood near the window with his hands in his pockets. From there, he could see a slice of Michigan Avenue, the traffic lights changing in the winter dark, the city continuing as if his life had not nearly collapsed in front of 500 people. Detective Reeves had asked him to stay available. Helen Morris had stepped into the hallway to call her editor. Paul Whitaker was with counsel. Daniel Cross was in a side room, no longer shouting. Victor Lang was still in the ballroom with his lawyer and 2 officers nearby. For the first time in almost an hour, no one was accusing Richard of anything to his face. That should have felt like relief. It did not. He turned from the window when Annie's juice straw made a small squeak against the carton. "Do you like apple juice?" he asked because he had no better sentence for a child who had saved him from public ruin. Annie nodded. "Only the cold kind. This one cold enough. It's okay." Grace gave her daughter a look. "Annie, what? It is okay." Richard smiled faintly. "Honest review. I respect it." Grace sat across from Annie, but did not relax. She had not removed her cleaning badge. It still hung against her chest, reminding everyone in the room why she had been allowed near the gala in the first place, and why people had tried to dismiss her daughter. Richard noticed the badge. "Grace, you can take that off if you want." She touched it. "I'm still on the clock." "No, you're not, Mr. Bennett. With respect, I don't know what I am tonight." The sentence held more weight than complaint. It was the truth of a woman who knew help could disappear when rich people became embarrassed. Richard pulled out a chair and sat. Not at the head of the table, but to the side. "You are employed. You and Annie are safe in the apartment. Nothing that happened tonight changes that." Grace looked at him for a long second. "I need that in writing." He nodded without offense. "You'll have it before you leave." Annie looked between them. "Mommy says paper remembers better than people." Richard looked at Grace. "Your mother gives strong advice." "She has had to," Grace said. The door opened and Helen Morris came in with her recorder off for once. She held a paper cup of black coffee and looked like a woman who had already written the first 3 paragraphs in her head. "Detective Reeves is having the hotel pull the full-service corridor footage," Helen said. She also asked it to preserve access logs before Daniel's lawyers start using words like accidental and incomplete. Richard leaned back. "Will the footage be enough?" "It will be enough to start," Helen said. "The blue ink may be what keeps the public from swallowing Victor's version by breakfast." Annie stopped chewing. "My blue." Helen looked at her. "Yes, you're blue. I just remembered that is what good witnesses do." Grace said she is 6. "I know." Helen said that's why we protect her carefully and don't turn her into a headline. Richard looked at Helen. "Can you do that?" "I can control what I write. I can't control every outlet. But I can set the tone. No address, no school, no apartment location, no photos of her face. Unless Grace approves." Grace answered at once. "No photos." Helen nodded. "Then no photos from me." Annie lowered her cracker. "Am I in trouble for taking the silver thing?" "No," Grace said. Helen added. "You picked up something that had been dropped. You kept it safe. That is different from stealing." Annie considered this. "Mr. Daniel said it was company property." Richard's voice changed at Daniel's name. "Daniel said many things tonight because he wanted you scared." "He did scare me," Annie said plainly. Grace reached across the table and touched her hand. Richard looked down. That answer pierced him more sharply than Daniel's accusation had. Adults could defend themselves with lawyers, money, reputation, anger. Annie had stood in the open with a USB and a child's memory. "I'm sorry," Richard said. Annie tilted her head. "For what?" "For telling you to go home when you were trying to help. You were being nice. I was also wrong." Annie accepted that with a small nod, as if adults admitting mistakes was unusual but welcome. Helen sipped her coffee. "Mr. Bennett, there is something else you need to understand. Victor will not stop with the ballroom. By morning, clips of the accusation will be online. Some will show only the documents. Some will show you being escorted. Some will show Annie shouting. The truth will have to be clearer than the lie." Richard rubbed a hand over his face. "Then we make it clear. You don't make it emotional first," Helen said. "You make it documented. Access logs, original signatures, independent forensic review, police case number, foundation account freeze. Then and only then, you speak from the heart." Grace gave a quiet sound. "That's how my grandmother handled church fights." Helen looked at her. "Smart woman, mean when necessary, the best kind." A knock came at the door. Detective Reeves entered with a man from Bennett and Marcia Bell, the compliance officer. Marcia carried a folder and looked as if she had aged 5 years since dessert. "We found the source of the signature scan," Marcia said without sitting. "It came from a vendor renewal packet Mr. Bennett signed last March. Corporate side, not foundation. Daniel had administrative access to the scanned archive." Richard nodded slowly. "And the approval code built from an old corporate vendor template. Someone tried to make it look official but used the wrong structure for a foundation disbursement." Helen turned her recorder back on and set it on the table. "Can you repeat that?" Marcia glanced at Reeves. The detective said, "You can state what you found. Keep it factual." Marcia repeated it clearly. Richard watched her hands as she spoke. They were steady, but her eyes were not. Marcia had worked for the foundation for 9 years. She had trusted Daniel, too. Reeves looked at Richard. "We also pulled service corridor footage from 2 additional angles. Mr. Cross meets a man named Peter Vale. Vale is listed as a consultant for Langford Capital." Helen wrote the name down. Peter Vale. Victor's man now had a name. Names changed things. They gave investigators something to subpoena, journalists something to verify, guilty people something to deny. Grace looked at Reeves. "Do we have to stay much longer?" "No," Reeves said. "I want Annie home. I'll arrange a neutral car. Tomorrow I'll have a child advocate call you. We'll take Annie's statement properly, not in a hotel room after she's been up too late." Annie straightened. "I'm not sleepy." Grace looked at her. Annie corrected herself. "I'm a little sleepy." Richard stood. "Before you go, I owe you the letter." He took a sheet of Bennett Global letterhead from the side desk. His hand paused over the pen cup. There were black pens, hotel pens, 1 red marker, and at the bottom, a blue fountain pen he had carried out of habit for years. Annie saw it first. "That's the promise pen," she said. Richard looked at the pen, then at her. "Yes," he wrote slowly. Grace Carter's employment would remain secure. Her housing arrangement would not be affected by any event of the evening. No retaliation would be permitted against her or her daughter. Any change to her position would require review by independent HR counsel and written approval from Richard Bennett himself. He signed in blue ink. Then he slid it to Grace. She read every line. Richard respected that. He had once thought trust meant people did not need to read what he gave them. Tonight had taught him better. Grace folded the paper carefully and placed it in her purse. "Thank you." "No," Richard said. "Thank you for raising her." Grace looked at Annie, who was now fighting sleep with the stubborn dignity of a child who did not want to be carried. "She raises me some days." Reeves opened the door. "Car is ready." Annie climbed down from the chair. Before leaving, she walked to Richard and held out her hand. He looked surprised, then shook it gently. "Good night, Mr. Richard." "Good night, Annie. Don't let Mr. Daniel take your papers anymore." "I won't. And listen faster next time." Grace saw her. Annie Carter. Richard smiled. I promised I would. Annie seemed satisfied. Grace and Annie left with Detective Reeves. Helen followed them to ensure no cameras waited in the hall. When the door closed, the room felt larger and colder. Marcia remained near the table. I should have caught the code format sooner. Richard shook his head. Daniel built it to move fast. He used our trust. Yes, Richard said, and my blindness. Marcia did not argue. Through the wall came the faint sound of the ballroom being cleared. Chairs moved, glassware collected. The ordinary labor that followed extraordinary nights. Richard thought of Grace and the other workers who would normally be invisible at this hour. He had built a foundation to help children outside his company while nearly failing to see the child sitting in his own hallway. Helen returned alone 10 minutes later. They're gone, she said. No cameras got close. Thank you. I'm still writing the story. I know. It won't make you a saint. I'm not asking it to. Helen studied him. Good. Richard looked at the blue signature drawing on the duplicate copy of Grace's letter. What happens next? He asked. Helen kept a pen. Next, Daniel decides whether Victor is worth prison. Victor decides whether Daniel is disposable. The police follow the documents. I follow the money and you decide whether Bennett Hope was built strong enough to survive the man you trusted. Richard looked toward the dark ballroom and Annie. Helen's face softened. Annie goes home, eats breakfast, goes to school if her mother allows it, draws something with that blue crayon of hers. That is what should happen to children after they tell the truth. They should get to be children again. Richard nodded, but he knew the night had already changed her and him and the foundation that carried his name. The lie had entered through the back door, dressed in documents and signatures. Annie had dragged it into the light with one small hand. Now the adults had to prove they deserved what she had risked. By 7 the next morning, Chicago had already begun deciding what kind of story it wanted. On one station, Richard Bennett was a billionaire under investigation. On another, he was a philanthropist targeted by a corporate rival. Online, short clips traveled faster than facts. One showed the transfer documents on the ballroom screen. Another showed Daniel Cross shouting for security to remove Annie. A third showed Richard saying, "No one touches her." And that was the one Grace hated least. She sat at the small kitchen table in the employee apartment with a mug of coffee she had reheated twice. Annie sat across from her in pajamas, eating scrambled eggs and toast cut into 4 squares. The television volume was low, but not low enough. "Mommy," Annie said, pointing with her fork. "That's Mr. Richard." Grace reached for the remote and turned the screen off. "You already know what happened. You were there. But the TV people don't know, right?" "No, they don't. Can we tell them?" Grace looked at her daughter's face, still soft with sleep, still young enough to ask why grown-ups did not simply say the truth and be done with it. "Detective Reeves will help us tell it the right way. Miss Helen, too." Annie chewed slowly. "Do I have school?" Grace had asked herself that question since dawn. Keeping Annie home felt safe. Sending her to school felt like refusing to let men like Daniel Cross steal another ordinary thing from them. She finally said, "Not today. Today we rest, and we talk to Detective Reeves." Annie nodded as if rest were a serious appointment. A knock came at the door at 8:15. Grace checked the peephole before opening it. Detective Angela Reeves stood in the hallway with a woman in a navy coat and low heels. "Morning, Mrs. Carter," Reeves said. "This is Miss Linda Park, child advocate. She's here for Annie, not for the police." Grace opened the door wider. "Come in." Annie slid down from her chair. "Good morning, Detective Reeves." "Good morning, Annie. You eat breakfast?" "Yes, eggs." "Good. Eggs help the truth come out straight." Annie looked at Grace to see if that was real. Grace almost smiled. "Sit down, baby." Linda Park introduced herself with a warm voice and no rush. She did not touch Annie. She did not crowd her. She asked about her ribbons, her school, and whether she liked drawing animals or people better. Annie said people were harder because noses looked funny. Only after Annie relaxed did Reeves place a small recorder on the table. Annie, we're going to talk about what you saw. If you don't know something, you say you don't know. If you need a break, you say break. Nobody is angry with you. Even if I forget, especially if you forget, guessing is not truth. Annie liked that. Okay. Grace sat beside her daughter. She kept one hand flat on the table, close enough for Annie to touch if she wanted. Reeves began gently. Tell me about the night you found the silver drive. Annie told it again. The crayons, the blue one rolling near the conference room door. Daniel at the cabinet, the brown folder, the man by the back door, the silver USB by the plant with white rocks. She did not say it perfectly. She went backward once. She asked for water twice, but the center of it did not move. Linda Park asked, "Did anyone tell you what to say today?" "No." "Did Mr. Richard ask you to help him?" "No, he told me to go back to Mommy." Reeves glanced at Grace, then continued. "Did Mr. Daniel ask you for the USB?" "Yes." "When?" "At the party. He said, give it to him." "How did that make you feel?" Annie frowned like when somebody smiles, but the smile is not nice. Grace looked down. Reeves let the silence sit. That's a good answer. At Bennett Global Tower, Richard Bennett had not gone home either. He had slept for 40 minutes on the couch in his office and woke with his tie still on. By morning, his building felt different. Employees moved with caution. Some greeted him. Some avoided his eyes. Some looked relieved that he was there at all. In the main conference room, Paul Whitaker, Marcia Bell, outside counsel, Bennett's head of security, and 2 forensic accountants sat around the table with laptops open. Helen Morris had been allowed into part of the meeting on background, though she made clear she would not trade truth for access. Richard stood at the window until Marcus spoke. "We found the drafts," she said. 3 transfer packets, 1 used last night, 2 scheduled for release if you denied the first. Paul removed his glasses. "Released to whom?" "Press, donor list, and 2 board members." Richard turned. Daniel planned a second wave. Outside counsel nodded to make denial look like escalation. Helen wrote something in her notebook. Classic. Richard looked at her. Meaning first accusation wounds. Second accusation makes the wound look infected. Marcia clicked to another file. The fake transfer documents were built on real foundation letterhead pulled from our archive. The signatures came from scanned corporate documents. The approval language was copied from vendor payments. Whoever assembled it knew your systems, but not well enough. Daniel knew enough, Richard said. He had help. Marcia replied. The metadata shows files were exported to an outside drive at 11:30 p.m. 3 nights ago, same night Annie saw him. Then they were opened on a machine registered to Langford Capital. The room went still. Paul said, "You're certain as metadata allows before a forensic report." "But yes." Helen underlined something that connects Victor outside. Counsel raised a hand. "Careful, it connects a Langford machine." Richard looked at him. "We all know whose machine it was meant to be." "Knowing and proving here-ness," counsel said. Helen closed her notebook. "That's why people like Daniel survived so long." At 9:30, Detective Reeves arrived at Bennett Tower with another detective and a warrant request already in motion. She met Richard in the same conference room where Daniel had stolen the files. "You look like you slept in a chair," she said. "Couch luxury." Richard almost smiled. "How is Annie?" "She did well. She should not be questioned again unless necessary. She won't be by us." Reeves studied him. "Make sure your lawyers understand that people under pressure start treating children like loose ends." "Annie is not a loose end." "Good." Marcia handed Reeves a packet. Access logs, metadata summary, document comparison, and list of everyone with cabinet access. Reeves opened it. Daniel, Mr. Bennett, compliance, legal, and 1 temporary admin credential created last month, Marcia said. Richard looked at her. "For whom?" Marcia's face tightened. "It was requested by Daniel, assigned to a vendor consultant." Reeves read the name Peter Vale. Helen exhaled through her nose. "The man in the scarf." Richard placed both hands on the back of a chair. Daniel gave Victor's man internal access. Outside counsel said allegedly. Richard looked at him. Noted. His phone rang. The screen showed an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but Reeves saw his hesitation. Put it on speaker, she said. Richard answered. This is Bennett. Victor Lang's voice came through, smooth, but thinner than the night before. Richard, we should speak before this becomes more destructive. Reeves raised a finger to her lips. Helen's pen was already moving. Richard said, you mean before it becomes more destructive for you? I mean before our companies, our foundations, and everyone around us suffer permanent damage. Daniel acted emotionally. I acted on information presented to me. You stood in my ballroom and called me a thief. I said the documents raised grave concerns. Richard looked at Helen. She mouthed liar. Victor continued. There is a path here. We jointly announced that an internal employee misled both sides. You step back temporarily. I withdraw public pressure. We let counsel handle the rest quietly. Richard's face hardened. Quietly. That would be best for the children, wouldn't it? The room changed at that sentence. Not loudly. No one moved. But every adult there understood when children were being used as a shield. Richard's voice stayed calm. You don't get to hide behind children after using their foundation as a weapon. Victor paused. Think carefully. I am. You have more to lose than I do. Richard looked at Reeves. The detective gave a slight nod to keep him talking. No, Richard said. Last night, I thought that was true. Then a 6-year-old with a USB understood courage better than every man in the room. I'm done being managed by fear. Victor's voice cooled. Then enjoy the headlines. The call ended. Helen looked up. That was generous of him. Richard stared at the phone. Generous. He just gave us motive, pressure, and consciousness of guilt in under 2 minutes. Detective Reeves reached for the device. I'll need that call log. Richard handed over the phone without argument. Back at the apartment, Annie had finished her statement and was drawing at the table while Grace spoke with Linda Park near the door. Annie used blue crayon first. She drew a tall man, a woman with a mop, a detective with short hair, and a small girl holding something shaped like a stick. Grace looked over. What is that? The silver thing. You can draw something else now, Annie thought for a moment. Then she added a bed in the corner of the picture with a blanket and 2 pillows. Grace's throat tightened. Why the bed? Because that's why I knew. Annie said. Knew what? That Mr. Richard was not the bad one. Grace sat beside her. Baby, people can do one good thing and still do wrong things. I know, Annie said, choosing the blue crayon again. But he looked sad when they said he took from kids. Mr. Daniel looked mad when I said the truth. That's different. Grace had no answer that improved on it. At Bennett Tower, Richard watched Detective Reeves leave with the copied files, access logs, and his phone record. Helen stayed behind. I'm publishing this afternoon, she said carefully. The story is no longer Billionaire accused. It is false charity theft allegation tied to internal breach. Will people believe it? Some will, some won't. People are stubborn with first impressions. Richard nodded. What about Annie? She will not be the headline, but she will be in the story because she matters. Richard looked toward the hallway Daniel had used for years. Make sure they know she was brave. Helen kept her pen. I'll make sure they know she was truthful. Brave is what readers will understand after that. By noon, the first warrants were being drafted. By 1, Langford Capital's legal office stopped answering calls. By 2, Daniel Cross's attorney requested a meeting with prosecutors. And by 3, Richard Bennett stood alone in the conference room where the lie had begun, staring at the cabinet Daniel had opened. The lock was being replaced. The system was being repaired. The story was moving. But the thing that stayed with him was not the fake signature or Victor's phone call or Daniel's anger. It was Annie at the edge of the red carpet, refusing to go home when he told her this place was not right for her. Richard understood now that he had been wrong about the place. The room had not been too important for Annie. It had not been important enough to deserve her. Helen Morris published at 3:42 p.m. She did not use Annie's picture. She did not name the school. She did not mention the employee apartment or the hallway where Grace kept their shoes lined up by the door. The headline was plain enough to survive the noise. Internal breach raises questions about false charity theft claims against Richard Bennett. Richard read it twice in his office. The first time he read like a man searching for damage. The second time he read like a man searching for the truth he had missed. Helen had written the story in layers. First came the accusation at the gala. Then the documents that appeared to show charity funds moving under Richard's authorization. Then came the video, the USB, Daniel Cross accessing private contracts after hours, the service exit meeting with Peter Vale, and the mismatched signatures. She described Annie only as the young daughter of a Bennett employee, and wrote that the child had alerted adults to evidence after witnessing a late-night exchange in the building. That restraint meant more to Richard than any praise. Paul Whitaker stood near the window with the article open on his tablet. "This will slow the bleeding." Richard looked up. "It won't stop it." "No, but it gives people permission to doubt the first story." Marcia Bell sat at the conference table surrounded by folders. Donors are calling. Some want to pause gifts until the review ends. Some want reassurance. One school principal from Englewood left a message saying she still needs the library grant and does not care which rich man is fighting which rich man as long as the books arrive. Richard almost smiled. "Call her first." Paul nodded. "That is the right instinct. It should have been my first instinct last night." Paul lowered the tablet. "Last night, none of us were at our best." "No," Richard said. "Annie was." That ended the sentence because no one could improve it. Across the city, Grace read the article on her phone while Annie napped on the couch with a blanket pulled to her chin. Grace had not meant to let her sleep there, but the child had drawn 3 pictures, asked 6 questions about detectives, eaten half a peanut butter sandwich, and then folded into sleep before Grace could move her. The phone buzzed again. Another message from a number Grace did not know. "Is this the mother of the girl from the gala? We can pay for exclusive interview." She deleted it. Another buzz. "Mrs. Carter, this is Channel 8. We would like to hear Annie's side." Deleted. Then one from her cousin Denise. "Girl, please tell me that baby on the news ain't Annie." Grace stared at that one for a long time before answering. "It is. She is safe. Don't post anything." Denise replied fast. "I won't." "Want me to come over?" Grace looked at the sleeping child. At the folded letter from Richard on the table, at the cheap clock above the stove, she almost said, "No," out of habit. Then she wrote, "Yes, bring soup if you have some." At Bennett Tower, Richard's phone had been returned after the call log was copied. It rang every few minutes. Lawyers, donors, reporters, one senator's office, 2 hospital administrators, a bank president who spoke in the careful tone of a man not yet choosing sides. At 4:30, Detective Reeves called. "We executed a preservation order on Langford Capital server," she said. Richard stood straighter and their counsel suddenly wants to cooperate in a very limited, very decorative way. Victor not talking. Peter Vale is missing. Richard closed his eyes. Missing. Not officially. His attorney says he is unavailable. His phone is off. His apartment manager says he left this morning with a suitcase. Daniel, that's why I'm calling. His lawyer requested a proper meeting. Paul, hearing the tone, stepped closer. Richard asked. He wants to talk. He wants to save himself. Reeves said that is not the same thing, but sometimes it walks through the same door. What do you need from me? Nothing tonight. Tomorrow. Maybe records. And Mr. Bennett, yes. Do not contact Daniel. Do not contact Victor. Do not contact Peter Vale even if he sends you a Christmas card and a confession. I understand. Good. Rich people get creative when scared. I am learning that. Reeves paused. So do innocent ones. Don't. The call ended. Richard relayed the update. Paul rubbed his forehead. Marcia looked at the folders as if they had become heavier. If Daniel talks, Marcia said he may try to pull others in. Let him, Richard said. If there are others, I want them found. Paul looked at him carefully. Even if that makes the foundation look weaker. Richard turned toward him. Paul, a foundation that survives by hiding rot does not deserve donations. For the first time that day, Paul seemed fully convinced Richard was not thinking like a man protecting his image. He was thinking like someone who had almost lost the right to keep his name. At 5:15, Grace's cousin Denise arrived with chicken noodle soup, cornbread wrapped in foil, and the kind of presents that filled a small apartment without asking permission. She was older than Grace by 10 years, broad-shouldered, sharpied, and still wearing her pharmacy technician scrubs. Annie woke to the smell of soup. Dennis. There she is, Denise said, setting the pot on the stove. The smallest witness in Chicago. Grace shot her a look. Denise raised both hands. Too soon. Yes. Annie sat up. What's witness? Denise looked at Grace for help. Grace said, someone who tells what they saw. Annie considered this. Then yes. Denise's face softened. Then yes, baby. They ate at the small table. Denise did not ask Annie for details. She asked whether the gala had cake, whether the rich people had real flowers or fake ones, whether Mr. Richard looked taller on stage than in the hallway. Annie answered carefully. The cake had strawberries. The flowers were real because one petal fell off. Mr. Richard looked tall but sad. Grace listened and realized Denise was doing what family did when family was wise, letting a child come back to earth by talking about ordinary things. After dinner, Grace's phone rang again. This time the number was Bennett Tower. She hesitated. Denise noticed. Want me to answer? Grace shook her head and picked up. This is Grace. Mrs. Carter. It's Richard Bennett. Grace stood without meaning to. Mr. Bennett, you don't have to stand up for a phone call. She looked around, embarrassed that he somehow guessed. Habit. I won't keep you. I wanted to make sure the reporters are not bothering you. They are calling. I'm not answering. I can have counsel send a privacy notice. Helen Morris also offered to help route legitimate requests away from you. Grace leaned against the counter. I don't want Annie turned into a story. She won't be by me. There was a pause. Grace said. People make promises when they are grateful. Richard accepted the rebuke. Then let me make this one when I am accountable. Annie's privacy will be protected because it is right, not because she helped me. Grace looked at her now, showing Denise how the USB had fit in her hand. All right. And Grace, yes, your shift is covered for the week. Paid. Take the time. Grace's first response was suspicion, then relief, then guilt for needing relief. I can work. I know you can. That is not the question. She sat down slowly. Thank you. No, please just rest. After the call, Denise watched her. He giving you trouble? Grace shook her head. No, that's the strange part. At Bennett Tower, Richard hung up and found Helen Morris waiting outside his office. She had refused a visitor badge that said VIP and taken one that said, Press, you look like you're about to ask something unpleasant. Richard said, I am. Come in. She entered but did not sit. Daniel's attorney contacted my editor. Off-theory message. Daniel claims there are recordings of you approving aggressive accounting practices at Bennett Global. Not foundation theft, but enough to muddy you up. Richard let out a slow breath. Is there truth in it? Helen watched him closely. Richard answered before she had to ask again. Probably not theft, not charity money, but aggressive accounting. Yes, I built fast. I pushed hard. I signed off on things I would phrase differently under oath. Victor will use that. I know Daniel will use it to say you created the culture. Richard looked through the glass wall of his office toward the desks outside. So many people had worked late because he had asked. So many had treated impossible deadlines like weather. Maybe I did, he said. Helen's expression changed slightly. That was not the answer your lawyers would prefer. I'm not talking to my lawyers right now. You should. I will. But answer me this as a reporter. Can a man be innocent of one thing and guilty of making it easier for bad men to do another? Helen took a moment. Yes. Richard nodded. Then write that when the time comes. I might. Good. Helen sat now. You understand that clearing your name may not make you look spotless. I am past wanting spotless. Most men say that until the ink dries. Richard looked at the blue pen on his desk. Then I'll sign what is true and live with the color. That evening, Annie brushed her teeth while Grace stood in the bathroom doorway. The apartment felt different, not bigger, not safer, exactly, but watched by forces Grace could not yet name. Police, press, lawyers, gratitude, danger. Annie spit into the sink and looked up. Can I go to school tomorrow? Grace hesitated. Maybe not tomorrow. Will kids ask me things? Maybe. What do I say? You say your mama told you not to talk about grown folks' business at school. Annie dried her mouth with a towel. But you said it wasn't just grown folks' business. Grace leaned against the door frame. Children remembered too much when adults were tired. You're right, she said. Then you say, I told the truth and the grown-ups are handling the rest. Annie practiced it once. I told the truth and the grown-ups are handling the rest. Good. Are they? Grace looked at her reflection in the mirror at the worry beneath her own eyes. They better. Across town, Detective Reeves stood in an interview room while Daniel Cross sat with his attorney. The recorder was on. A cup of untouched water sat in front of him. His lawyer said, my client is prepared to provide information regarding Langford Capital's involvement. Reeves sat down. Start with Victor Lang. Daniel's eyes were red but dry. Victor planned the Gala exposure 6 weeks ago. Who forged the transfer documents? Daniel looked at the recorder, then at the wall. I assembled them, he said. But Victor told me exactly what he needed them to do. Reeves did not react. And what was that? Daniel swallowed to make Richard Bennett look guilty before he had time to prove he wasn't. Outside that room, the city kept moving. Buses hissed at curbs. Office lights burned late. In a small apartment, Annie slept with a blue crayon on her nightstand. In a tower downtown, Richard Bennett stayed at his desk, reading old policies he should have read years ago. By morning, the lie would have a new shape. But now, it had names. By morning, Daniel Cross's confession had not reached the public, but it had reached the people who mattered. Detective Reeves called Richard at 6:18 a.m. He was still in his office. Jacket off, sleeves rolled, the blue pen lying uncapped beside a stack of old policy binders. Daniel is cooperating, she said. Richard closed his eyes. How much? Enough to confirm Victor Lang planned the false accusation before the gala. Enough to confirm Peter Vale received the files. Enough to confirm the transfer documents were designed to force your board into removing you before independent review. Richard looked at the window. Dawn had turned the glass gray. Chicago was waking up beneath him. Buses moving through wet streets. Office lights appearing one floor at a time. Did Daniel say why? Reeves gave a dry breath. Money, position, resentment. The usual ugly stew. Did he munch Annie? Yes. Richard's hand tightened around the phone. What did he say? That he didn't know she saw him until the gala. He noticed the USB when she held it up. That's when he panicked. Richard let that sit. He tried to take it from her. He knows. His lawyer knows. I know what happens next. We're looking for Peter Vale. We're preparing warrants tied to Langford Capital. Victor's lawyers will make noise. Don't answer noise. Richard almost smiled. You give that advice often. Every week. When the call ended, Richard sat down slowly. Daniel had spoken. That should have brought relief. But all Richard could think about was how close the lie had come to winning. If Annie had listened when he told her to go home. If Grace had pulled her away. If Helen had not noticed Daniel's fear. If the technician had refused to play the USB, Richard Bennett would have been removed from his own foundation before dessert plates were cleared. He picked up the blue pen and capped it. At 8, the emergency board meeting began. Not in the ballroom this time, but in the main conference room on the 21st floor. No candles, no flowers, no piano, coffee and paper cups, legal pads, tired faces. Men and women who had spent years attaching their names to Bennett Hope now had to decide whether they had nearly helped bury an innocent man because the papers looked official. Paul Whitaker opened the meeting. Daniel Cross has been suspended pending termination for cause. His system access has been revoked. Outside counsel has begun preservation. Detective Reeves has requested full cooperation. I propose we appoint an independent forensic accounting firm by noon. Marcia Bell said, we also need to notify major grantees before they hear another twisted version online. Richard nodded. Agreed. One board member, Charles Denby, cleared his throat. He was a real estate developer. 71. Expensive suit. Careful reputation. Richard, before we move too far, we must consider optics. If we announce a broad review, it could make the public think there is more wrong than there is. Richard looked at him. There may be more wrong than we know. Charles frowned. That is exactly the kind of sentence we should not say aloud. It is exactly the kind we should have said years ago. The room went still. Richard leaned forward. Daniel had too much access. I allowed that. The foundation and the company shared systems they should not have shared. I allowed that, too. I am innocent of stealing from Bennett Hope, but I am not innocent of trusting convenience more than controls. Hall looked down at his notes. Charles said, that level of admission may create liability. So does arrogance. Richard said, we tried that. It brought us here. Marcia Bell spoke before Charles could answer. The schools need certainty. The hospitals need certainty. Staff need certainty. An independent review gives them that. Charles looked at her. And if it finds mistakes, Marcia did not blink. Then we correct them. Richard turned to Paul. Put it to a vote. The motion passed. Charles voted yes last. At the Carter apartment, Grace had made oatmeal because it was what she could manage without thinking too hard. Annie sat at the table in a yellow sweater, her braids freshly tied, a blue crayon beside her spoon. Denise had gone home late the night before, but promised to come back after work. Grace's phone rang with a number she knew now. Mrs. Carter, Richard said, is this an okay time? Grace looked at Annie, who was making a small road in the oatmeal with the back of her spoon. It's fine. I wanted you to know Daniel has admitted part of what he did. Detective Reeves will guide the rest. I also wanted to ask before making any public statement involving Annie. Grace said straighter. Ask what? I would like to say that a young witness came forward with evidence. No name, no image, no details that identify her, only that the foundation is grateful. Grace was quiet. Richard waited. He did not feel the silence and she appreciated that. Finally, she said, you can say young witness, not little girl, not brave child, not janitor's daughter. Understood. She is not a symbol for people to pass around. No, Richard said, she is Annie. Grace softened, but only a little. Thank you. And Grace, the board is creating an independent review. Not because I stole, but because our systems failed. That sounds right. You think so? I clean buildings, Mr. Bennett. When something smells bad, you don't spray perfume and call it fixed. You find where it's coming from. Richard was silent for a moment. Would you mind if I quoted that someday? Yes. He laughed quietly. Fair. Annie looked up. Is that Mr. Richard? Grace handed her the phone only after putting it on speaker. Say good morning. Good morning, Mr. Richard. Good morning, Annie. Did you sleep? Yes, I had oatmeal. That sounds healthier than my breakfast. What did you have? Coffee. That's not breakfast. I am being corrected a lot lately. You should eat toast, Annie said. I will. Grace took the phone back before Annie could begin managing the billionaire's diet. We'll speak later. Thank you, Grace. After the call, Annie stirred the oatmeal again. Mommy, is Mr. Daniel going to jail? I don't know. Did he say sorry? Grace thought of all the apologies poor people were expected to accept from people who had not changed. Not to us. Should he? Yes. Would it fix it? Grace looked at her daughter. No, but it would tell the truth about what he broke. At 10:30, Helen Morris arrived at Bennett Tower for Richard's statement. She was not there to help him look clean. She made that clear before the cameras were set. If you try to make this about being rescued by a child, I'll write that you used her. Richard nodded. I won't. If you pretend your systems were perfect except for one bad assistant, I'll write that, too. They weren't perfect. Good. Say that. The statement was delivered in a plain media room, not the ballroom. Richard stood without a backdrop of children's photos. Helen had advised against it. No props, no borrowed innocence. He looked into the cameras and spoke for 6 minutes. Last night, false documents were presented accusing me of stealing from Bennett Hope Foundation. I did not steal from this foundation. I did not authorize the transfers shown on that screen. Evidence now in the hands of law enforcement indicates those documents were part of a deliberate attempt to mislead our board, our donors, and the public. A young witness came forward with information that helped expose the breach. Her privacy will be protected. Her family will be protected. This foundation owes her gratitude, not attention. Helen, standing near the back, watched his hands. They did not shake. Richard continued, I also owe this community honesty. The fact that false documents could be built from our internal systems means our controls failed. I take responsibility for that failure. An independent forensic review begins today. Until it is complete, all major foundation transfers will be reviewed by outside counsel and compliance. Every promised grant will be accounted for. Every child, clinic, school, and family, depending on Bennett Hope, will receive a written update. He paused. The people who tried to use children's charity as a weapon counted on confusion. We will answer with records. They counted on fear. We will answer with cooperation. They counted on silence. Last night, someone smaller than everyone in the room reminded us that silence is where lies grow. He did not say Annie's name. Grace watched from her apartment and noticed. Annie sat beside her eating toast because she had decided everyone should. He ate breakfast. Grace looked at the screen, maybe after the press shouted questions when Richard finished. He did not take them. Helen respected that a statement was not a trial. The records would have to do the harder work. By noon, Bennett Hope's largest hospital partner released a careful note saying it would continue cooperating with the foundation pending the independent review. By 1, 3 school principals posted that their communities still needed the grants and welcomed transparency. By 2, Langford Capital issued a statement denying wrongdoing and accusing Richard of using emotional misdirection to avoid financial scrutiny. Helen read that line at her desk and said, "There he is." Her editor looked over. Victor cornered men always accuse someone else of theater. At 4, Detective Reeves found Peter Vale not in Chicago at O'Hare Terminal 3 with a ticket to Dallas and a laptop in his carry-on. He had not run far enough. People who thought they were clever often underestimated how fast warrants moved when a child's testimony, a corporate breach, and a billionaire scandal landed on the same desk. Reeves called Richard after Vale was in custody. "We have him," she said. Richard stood from his desk. Did he have the files? He had enough. Laptop, external drive, burner phone. We will know more after forensic review. And Victor. Victor is about to have a worse evening than he planned. Richard looked toward the framed grant letters on his wall. Good. Don't enjoy it too much, Reeves said. That's how men get sloppy. I'll try to remain miserable. That I believe. That evening, Grace allowed Annie to watch cartoons instead of the news. Denise came by with leftover cornbread and declared the apartment a no reporter, no billionaire, no police talk zone for 1 full hour. Annie accepted the rule, though she did ask whether detectives liked cornbread. Denise said everybody with sense liked cornbread. At bedtime, Annie placed the blue crayon on her nightstand. Grace tucked the blanket around her. You want the nightlight? Yes. Grace turned it on. Annie looked at the ceiling. Mommy, yes. When I'm big, can I help people with papers? Grace smiled a tired smile. You can help people however God lets you. Can I still color? You better. Annie closed her eyes, then opened them again. Mr. Richard said, I helped the truth. Grace sat on the edge of the bed. You did. Was the truth heavy? Grace brushed a braid away from her forehead. Too heavy for a child, but you carried it anyway. Annie thought about that, then whispered, next time. Grown-ups can carry it sooner. Grace kissed her forehead. Amen to that. Across town, Richard Bennett finally ate toast at his desk, cold and overdone from the office kitchen. He thought of Annie's instruction and took another bite. Anyway, outside his office, the independent review team worked late. In police custody, Peter Vale began deciding what Victor Lang was worth. In a newsroom, Helen Morris prepared the next story. In a small apartment, Annie slept. The first lie had been broken. The next one was waiting to be named. Peter Vale did not look like the kind of man who could help move a scandal across a city. He looked like a tired consultant who had missed a flight. Detective Reeves watched him through the glass of the interview room at O'Hare. He sat with his elbows on the table, a paper cup of water in front of him, his laptop bag on the floor beside an evidence marker. His red scarf had been taken and folded into a clear plastic bag. Without it, he looked smaller. Her partner, Detective Nolan, stood beside her with a folder. He says he was traveling for a client meeting with a burner phone and an external drive. Busy client. Reeves opened the folder. What did the drive show? Forensics did a fast preview. Contract drafts, donor lists, scanned signatures, board contact sheets, and 3 versions of the fake transfer packet. One folder is labeled BHF pressure sequence. Reeves looked at him. He labeled the crime plan. Consultants love folders. Inside the room, Peter Vale lifted his head when Reeves entered. His attorney, a young man with polished shoes and nervous eyes, sat beside him. My client has cooperated with your request to remain available, the attorney said. Reeves sat down. Your client was detained at an airport with stolen foundation documents. My client disputes the word stolen. Peter looked at the table. He did not look like he disputed much. Reeves placed a still image from the service corridor video in front of him. Daniel Cross handing him the brown folder, the Langford car behind them, the timestamp right in the corner. You know Daniel Cross, she said. Peter said nothing. You know Victor Lang. His attorney answered, Mr. Vale has performed consulting work for Langford Capital. Reeves placed another page down. This folder was on your external drive. BHF pressure sequence. It includes the first fake transfer packet, the donor leak list, and a draft statement calling Richard Bennett a greedy fraud who used poor children as cover. That phrase appears almost word for word in Daniel Cross's statement at the gala. You want to tell me that's consulting, too? Peter finally spoke. I didn't forge anything. No one asked if you did. His attorney touched his sleeve. But Peter had the face of a man who had spent the morning learning he was not important enough to protect. I received files, he said. I delivered them. To whom? The attorney cut in. Detective, my client is not agreeing to. Peter interrupted him. To Victor's office. Reeves leaned back. Victor's office or Victor? Peter swallowed. Both at Bennett Tower. Richard sat in the boardroom while Marcia Bell walked through a timeline projected on the wall. This screen was different from the gala screen. No music, no flowers, no public humiliation, just dates, login, file transfers, access cards, and a line of decisions that showed how a trusted assistant had opened one door after another. Marcia pointed with a pen. Daniel creates the temporary vendor credential for Peter Vale. 2 days later, Vale's credential accesses a shared contract folder. That same evening, Daniel accesses the executive archive. 3 nights before the gala, Daniel enters the 12th floor conference room. Annie sees him. He drops the USB. At 11:30 p.m., files are exported. At 11:19 p.m., Vale's device connects to a Langford network. Paul Whitaker rubbed his eyes. It's worse when it's organized. Helen Morris sat near the end of the table. Organized is good for truth. Messy crimes let people blame fog. Organized crimes leave steps. Richard looked at the timeline and we missed every step. Marcia did not soften it. Yes. Charles Denby shifted in his chair. We should avoid language like that in minutes. Richard turned to him. Put it in the minutes. Charles looked annoyed. Richard, governance records are discoverable. Good. Paul lowered his hand. Richard, no. Richard said. If our minutes become evidence, let them show. The morning after we nearly failed, we stopped hiding from the word failure. Helen wrote that down. Charles noticed. Is the press now recording board meetings? Helen looked at him. Only the useful sentences. Richard almost smiled, but Marka was not finished. There's another issue. She said Daniel had been redirecting certain donor communications for weeks. Not money, messages, concerns, questions, anything related to restricted gifts or reporting delays went through him first. Richard looked up. Reporting delays minor at first. A hospital equipment report late by 2 weeks. A school library invoice missing an attachment. Nothing criminal by itself, but Daniel used small administrative gaps to make the foundation look sloppy. Then Victor's fake transfers landed on top of that. Helen said, so he prepared the room to believe the lie. Marcia nodded. Exactly. Richard felt the sentence settle. That was what hurt most. Daniel had not simply forged papers. He had taught people to doubt the foundation before the accusation arrived. Across town, Grace and Annie sat with Linda Park at the kitchen table. Annie had been asked to draw the hallway, not because anyone expected art to become evidence, but because Linda said children remembered places through shape. Annie drew the plant first, big green leaves, white rocks, then the elevator, then the door to the room with the long table, then a stick figure with a tie. Linda pointed gently. Is that Mr. Daniel? Yes. What is he holding? The folder. Where were you? Annie drew herself very small near the plant. Then she added a blue crayon on the floor. Grace watched quietly. It was strange seeing her daughter's fear become lines on paper. Linda said, "You're doing well, Annie." Annie looked up. Can I color something happy after? Yes. Can I draw Mr. Richard eating toast? Grace closed her eyes and laughed once despite herself. Why toast? Because he forgot breakfast. Linda smiled. That sounds like something worth drawing. Grace's phone rang. Detective Reeves. Mrs. Carter. Reeves said. Peterville is cooperating. I wanted you to hear from me before the story changes online. Annie's account remains consistent with the video. She did nothing wrong. Grace held the phone tighter. Thank you for saying that. I'll say it as many times as needed. Will Daniel come near us? No. His access is gone and we are discussing conditions with prosecutors. If anyone from his side contacts you, call me. Grace looked at Annie, who was now drawing toast with too much butter. I will. At O'Hare, Peter Vale's attorney had stopped trying to interrupt every answer. That told Reeves enough. Clients who were innocent needed protection from traps. Clients who were guilty needed protection from themselves. And Peter had already begun choosing survival. Victor wanted the exposure at the gala. Peter said he said public shame would move the board faster than litigation. His words, yes. What was your role? Receive the documents from Cross. Prepare media packets. Coordinate with 2 financial bloggers and 1 television producer. Push the idea that Bennett Hope had reporting irregularities. Did you know the transfer documents were fake? Peter stared at the cup of water. I knew they weren't verified. That's not the same answer. No. Try again. He breathed in. Yes, I knew. His attorney whispered. Peter, stop. Peter shook his head. Victor will say it was me or Daniel or both. I'm not going to prison for his press strategy. Reeves tapped the photo. Did Victor personally approve the fake transfers? Peter hesitated. Reeves waited. Finally, he said he didn't want details in email, but he reviewed the final packet in his office the morning of the gala. He said the signature looked real enough for panic. Reeves wrote that down. Real enough for panic. At Bennett Tower, Richard left the boardroom afternoon and walked down to the service level alone. His security chief tried to follow, but Richard asked him to stay back. He needed to see the building from the path Grace and Annie used. The service corridor smelled faintly of floor cleaner and warm metal from the freight elevator. Carts lined one wall. A bulletin board held shift schedules, safety notices, and a faded flyer for a Thanksgiving food drive. Near the elevator sat the large potted plant with white stones. Richard stopped there. This was where Annie had found the USB. This ordinary corner, this place important people never saw unless something broke. A custodian named Mr. Alvarez came around the corner pushing a cart. He stopped when he saw Richard. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Alvarez, Richard said, reading his name badge because he was ashamed he had to. Do you have a minute? The older man looked cautious. Yes, sir. Do people wait here often? Family members, children. Sometimes night shift is hard on parents. Babysitters cost money. Richard nodded. Was Annie here often? Some nights. Quiet kid draws a lot. Says thank you when you give her paper towels for spills. Richard looked at the plant. Did anyone ever complain? Mr. Alvarez's face gave the answer before his mouth did. Daniel Cross. Richard asked. He didn't like children in the halls. Didn't like staff sitting either. Said it looked unprofessional. Richard looked down the corridor. It is unprofessional to make workers bring children to night shifts because we don't pay enough for child care. Mr. Alvarez did not respond. Men in his position survived by letting rich men answer themselves. Richard turned back. That changes. Mr. Alvarez studied him. Tonight changes many things. Maybe. No, Richard said. Not tonight. Policy. That afternoon, Helen's second story went live. Consultant detained with Bennett Foundation files as fraud probe widens. Again, she kept Annie protected. Again, she kept the focus on documents. But one sentence traveled through the city. The evidence that interrupted the gala came from a place executives rarely look. The after-hours corridors where low-wage workers and their families wait. Grace read that sentence twice. Denise sitting beside her on the couch after work said, "That one's for you." Grace shook her head. "It's for all of us." Annie looked up from her drawing. "Is mine in there?" "No, baby," Grace said, "and that's good." Annie accepted that she was more interested in whether Richard's toast needed jelly. By evening, Victor Lang's name had moved from confident accuser to subject of investigation. Langford Capital issued another denial. This one was longer, which made Helen smile at her desk. At 6:40 p.m., Detective Reeves called Richard. "Peter Vale gave us real enough for panic," she said. Richard stood in the service corridor still near the plant. "What does that mean?" "It means Victor reviewed the packet." "Is it enough?" "It's a step. I'm learning justice enjoys stairs." "It does. And paperwork." Richard looked at the white rocks in the planter. "Detective, when this is done, remind me to thank Annie properly." "Thank her by leaving her alone until her mother says otherwise." He nodded. "Understood." After the call, Richard bent and picked up one loose white stone that had fallen onto the floor. He placed it back in the pot. It was a small thing, almost nothing, but Annie had noticed small things. The USB by the plant, the wrong color ink. Daniel's face when the truth got too close. Richard was beginning to understand that small things were not small to people who had no power. They were evidence. They were warnings. Sometimes they were the only doors left open. And somewhere in Chicago, Victor Lang was learning the same lesson too late. By the third morning, the story no longer belonged only to Richard Bennett. It had moved into school offices, church basement, hospital break rooms, boardrooms, barber shops, and kitchens where people drank coffee while saying they had known something was wrong from the start. Some had, most had not. That was the way public truth worked. Once it became safe to believe, everyone wanted to remember believing early. Richard was learning not to resent that. Resentment wasted energy and the foundation needed all of his. At 9, he met with the independent review team in a plain conference room with no cameras. Helen Morris was not there. Detective Reeves was not there. This was not a performance. On the table were binders from Bennett Hope, laptops from outside counsel, access logs, printed grant files, and a list of every program that depended on money now under review. Marcia Bell stood at the screen. "We have confirmed that no foundation funds reached the foreign account shown in Victor's packet. The account exists, but the transfer confirmations were fabricated," Paul Whitaker exhaled. "So, the money is still here." "Yes," Marcia said. "Restricted funds remain in foundation accounts. Some scheduled disbursements were delayed because Daniel redirected approval emails, but the money was not moved." Richard leaned forward. How many children's programs were affected by the delay? Marka looked at her notes. 4 school library grants, 2 clinic equipment payments, 1 meal program renewal, and a scholarship batch for first-generation college students. How long? Between 9 and 23 days. Richard looked at the list. Numbers were clean until you put faces behind them. 9 days could be a school waiting for books. 23 days could be a clinic holding off on equipment. A delayed scholarship could be a student wondering whether to enroll or give up. Release emergency bridge payments today. He said. Outside counsel lifted a hand. We should wait until the review. No, Richard said. Structure them through escrow if needed. Have outside counsel approve the path, but those programs don't wait because Daniel and Victor used them as cover. Hall nodded. We can do that. Charles Denby frowned but said nothing. He had said less since Richard insisted the minutes reflect failure. Marcia continued. There is one more issue. Langford Capital was preparing a public proposal to stabilize Bennett Hope if the board removed you. Peter Vale had draft language on his drive. Richard looked at the screen as she opened the file. The title was calm enough to be cruel. Emergency Stewardship Plan for At-Risk Charitable Assets. Hall read the first page and his face tightened. They were going to offer to manage our grants, not just manage, Marcia said. Redirect. Langford's proposal would have moved certain hospital and school commitments into a new fund controlled by their advisory partners. Richard's voice stayed quiet. They weren't trying only to destroy me. No, Marcus said they were trying to take the foundation. At Grace Carter's apartment, Annie was at the kitchen table drawing the potted plant again. The plant had become important to her. She drew the white rocks one by one, then placed a tiny silver rectangle beside them. Grace watched from the stove while oatmeal warmed. You keep drawing that plant. It helped. Annie said. The plant. It stayed there so I could remember where the silver thing fell. Grace stirred the oatmeal. That's one way to look at it. A knock came at the door. Grace checked the peephole and opened it to Denise, who entered carrying a grocery bag and the expression of a woman already annoyed. Your phone off? Denise asked. No. Then why didn't you answer? Because if I answer every call, I'll never breathe. Denise set the bag on the counter. Fair. I brought bananas, soup, and that cereal Annie likes with the little squares. Annie looked up. Cinnamon. Of course, cinnamon. I'm not new here. Grace smiled despite the weak pressing on her. Denise lowered her voice. Reporters downstairs. 1 car this morning. Detective Reeves told building security not to let anyone up. Good. Annie held up the drawing. Auntie Denise, this is the truth plant. Denise looked at it carefully. That plant better get a plaque. Grace shook her head. Don't give her ideas. Annie's eyes brightened. Can plants have plaques? Denise grinned. Rich people give plaques to everything. Why not a plant? Grace pointed the spoon at both of them. No plaques. Her phone rang. Bennett Tower. She almost let it go. Then she answered. Grace. Richard said is now all right. Yes. I wanted to update you before the news does. The foundation money was not stolen. The transfer documents were fake. Some payments were delayed, but we are releasing bridge funds today. Grace leaned against the counter. That is good. It is. But we also found Victor was preparing to take over foundation programs if I was removed. Grace looked at Annie, then lowered her voice. So it was never just about you. No, it was about the money people trusted us to move. Then move it right. Richard paused. That is the plan. No, Grace said. Not the plan, the duty. There was silence on the line. Then Richard said, you're right. Denise, listening from the table, mouthed, tell him about child care. Grace frowned at her. Denise mouthed again. Tell him. Grace sighed. Mr. Bennett, there is something else. Yes, if you are fixing things, look. At the night staff. People bring children because child care costs more than they make some weeks. Annie should not have been in that hallway at night. None of the kids should. Richard did not answer quickly, which Grace respected more than a fast promise. Finally, he said, I was in the service corridor yesterday. I saw where she waited. Then you saw enough. I did. Don't make it charity. Grace said. Make it policy. Charity depends on someone feeling generous. Policy stays when moods change. Richard wrote that down. Policy, he said. At the police station, Peter Vale's cooperation had turned from statements into documents. Detective Reeves sat with Assistant State's Attorney Nolan Price, unrelated to her partner, reviewing a chain of emails Peter had recovered from a private account. Nolan Price read aloud. Need panic before proof. Board must act before Bennett controls narrative. Sender VL Reeves leaned back. Victor Lang, his lawyers will say VL could be anyone. Not when attached to his calendar invite, his consultant, his car, and his draft takeover plan. Nolan tapped another page. Daniel Cross says Victor promised him chief operating officer of the new advisory structure of a stolen foundation. Allegedly, Reeves gave him a look. He smiled. Sorry, habit. She turned to the next document. What about charges? We can move on. Conspiracy, fraud, attempted theft by deception, forgery, related counts, and unlawful use of confidential business information. The charity angle makes it ugly. The child witness makes it uglier. Reeves shook her head. Don't build the case on Annie. I won't build it on the men who were dumb enough to write things down. That I can do. At Bennett Tower, Richard called an all-staff meeting for 4 o'clock. Not just executives. Everyone, office staff, security, custodians, kitchen workers, drivers, mailroom employees, reception, finance, legal. The atrium filled in layers of job titles that usually did not stand together unless the fire alarm went off. Richard stood on the first landing, not above them by much. I owe many of you an apology, he began. Not for the false accusation. I did not steal from Bennett Hope, but I owe you an apology for building a company where some people had too much access and others had too little voice. He looked down and found Mr. Alvarez near the back with the night cleaning crew. Daniel Cross was able to misuse trust because trust here flowed upward too easily and downward too rarely. Some of you saw things, heard things, felt things were wrong, and had no safe way to say so. That changes. No one clapped. They listened. Richard continued, effective immediately. We are creating an independent reporting line for all staff, including contractors and night employees. We are reviewing wages, child care support, after-hours family policies, and building access procedures. Not as a favor, as policy. At the word policy, Grace's sentence returned to him. He finished with care. A company that depends on invisible people has no right to call them invisible. In the back, Mr. Alvarez looked down. A kitchen worker wiped her hands on her apron. A security guard who had been on duty the night of the gala stood straighter. After the meeting, Paul approached Richard. That was expensive, Richard said. So was blindness. Paul nodded slowly. I'll help pass it. You'll do more than help. You'll argue for it with Charles. Paul smiled faintly. That may be the punishment I deserve. At home, Grace watched a clip of the staff meeting after Denise found it online. Annie leaned against her mother's side. Half interested, half sleepy, he said. Policy, Grace said. Denise crossed her arms. Good. I like when men learn vocabulary. Annie looked up. Is policy like promise? Grace thought about it. It should be. Is it blue? Denise laughed. Grace kissed the top of Annie's head. Tonight, Grace said, we'll say it is later. After Annie went to bed, Grace stood by the small kitchen window. The city moved below in headlights and bus brakes. She thought about the night Richard had given them a place to sleep. She had been grateful then, but gratitude had always made her nervous because it could become a leash if the wrong person held it. This felt different. Not safe yet, not finished, but different. Her phone buzzed with a message from Richard's office, a written confirmation, paid leave for the week, privacy support, housing protection, and a scheduled meeting to discuss child care policy for night staff with employee representatives present. Grace read it twice. Then she printed it on the small printer Denise had once insisted she buy for school forms. Paper remembered better than people. Across town, Victor Lang sat in a law office with 3 attorneys and no good options. Peter Vale had talked. Daniel had talked. The files had talked. The blue ink had talked. Even the service corridor had talked. Victor looked at the draft statement his lawyers prepared. Langford Capital denies all wrongdoing. He pushed it away. Not strong enough. His oldest attorney, a woman who had represented difficult men for 30 years, looked at him without sympathy. Mr. Lang's strength is not your problem. Evidence is. Victor stared at her. She closed the folder and evidence has become very talkative. The next morning, Victor Lang's denial ran on every business channel before most people finished their coffee. Langford Capital rejects all allegations. Mr. Lang acted in good faith after receiving credible internal documents regarding Bennett Hope Foundation. Any suggestion of conspiracy is false, irresponsible, and defamatory. Helen Morris read the statement at her desk, took one sip of coffee, and said, "Good faith has become the most overworked phrase in America." Her editor, Frank, stood behind her with his arms folded. "Can we prove he reviewed the fake packet?" Peter Vale says, "Yes." Daniel says, "Yes." The metadata says Langford opened the files before the gala. Victor's car was at the service door. His takeover plan was ready. Before the accusation landed, Frank nodded toward her screen. "But can we publish all of that?" "Not all. Not yet. That answer hurts my circulation. It protects the story." Frank smiled. "That's why I keep you." Helen turned back to her notes. The next article had to do more than embarrass Victor. It had to show how the lie was built piece by piece without making Annie the center of public hunger. A child had opened the door. Adults had to carry the rest. At Bennett Tower, Richard sat with Paul, Marcia, outside counsel, and the new forensic team. The mood was no longer panic. But panic had left its fingerprints everywhere. Every file request took longer. Every email sounded cautious. Every person in the room knew that whatever they found would end up in police hands, board minutes, or Helen's notebook. Marcia placed a new document on the screen. "This is the draft takeover plan from Peter Vale's drive. Page 7 lists programs Langford intended to pause pending governance restructuring." Richard read the list and felt his stomach tighten. Southside Reading Rooms, Winter Meal Partnership, Street Agnes Pediatric Equipment Fund, First Chance Nursing Scholarships. "These are the same programs Daniel delayed." He said. "Yes," Marcia said. He weakened confidence in the programs Victor planned to control. Paul leaned forward. The delay was not random. No, it created a record of administrative trouble. Then Victor arrived with fake theft documents and an emergency solution. Richard looked at the page. He was going to wound the foundation, then sell the bandage. Outside counsel said, "That is a strong phrase. I recommend not using it publicly." Richard looked at Helen, who had been allowed into the meeting after agreeing certain details would stay off record until cleared. Helen said, "Use it eventually. People understand bandages." Counsel closed his eyes briefly. Paul said, "Our immediate problem is donor confidence. 2 major donors requested private calls. One wants to delay a pledge." Richard nodded. "Set the calls, but no begging. We tell them the truth, give them records, and let them decide whether transparency scares them." Charles Denby, who had joined late and looked as if he disliked every sentence, said, "Donors don't like uncertainty." Marcia answered before Richard could. "Children like it less." Charles had no reply ready for that. At Grace's apartment, Annie was trying to return to normal life and finding normal smaller than she remembered. She had cereal with cinnamon squares, watched half a cartoon, and asked 3 times if Mr. Richard had eaten breakfast. Grace finally said, "Baby, I am not calling a billionaire to check his toast." Annie frowned, "But he forgets." Denise, who had stopped by before her pharmacy shift, pointed her spoon at Grace. "The child has identified a pattern." Grace gave her a look. "Do not encourage her." A knock came at the door. Grace's body tightened before she moved. Denise stepped closer to the hallway while Grace checked the peephole. It was Mr. Alvarez from the building staff holding a paper grocery bag. Grace opened the door. "Mr. Alvarez." He looked embarrassed. "Morning, Mrs. Carter. I brought some things from the staff kitchen. Nothing fancy. Fruit, muffins, milk. People wanted to send something but not bother you. Grace looked past him. People, night crew, security desk, a few kitchen ladies. We heard reporters called. Thought maybe breakfast was better than questions. Grace accepted the bag slowly. That's kind, Mr. Alvarez glanced at Annie, who had come to stand beside her mother. Morning, Miss Annie. Annie lifted her hand. Good morning. He nodded with gentle seriousness. The plant is doing fine. Annie's face brightened. The truth planted. Mr. Alvarez smiled. Yes, ma'am. White rocks and everything. After he left, Denise looked into the bag. Blueberry muffins. That man has sense. Grace placed the milk in the refrigerator. The gesture touched her more than she expected. Not because of the food, though food mattered. It was the quiet way people who cleaned, guarded, cooked, drove, and repaired had made a circle around Annie without asking to be seen. Annie took a banana from the bag. Can we give one to Detective Reeves? You are not feeding the whole city, Grace said. Denise said, let her start with Richard's toast. At the police station, Daniel Cross sat in another interview room with his attorney, looking less polished than he had in the ballroom. His tie was gone. His shirt collar was open. The anger had drained, leaving calculation and fatigue. Detective Reeves entered with Assistant State's Attorney Nolan Price. Mr. Cross, we need to go through Victor Lang's role again. Daniel's attorney said, my client has already provided substantial cooperation. Nolan Price sat down. Then more should be easy. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Victor wanted the Foundation's hospital and school contracts. Bennett Hope had trust he couldn't buy, so he planned to break that trust and step in as the responsible adult. Reeves said, who suggested using charity theft as the accusation? Daniel looked down. Victor. Who created the fake transfer packets? I assembled them from internal files. Peter refined the presentation. Did Victor know they were fake? Daniel paused. His attorney shifted beside him. Reeves waited. Daniel said, he said they didn't need to survive a courtroom. They needed to survive a news cycle. Nolan Price wrote it down. Exact words. Yes. Reeves leaned forward. And Annie. Daniel's face changed with irritation, then shame, then irritation again because shame did not sit comfortably on him. I didn't know she saw me, but when she appeared at the gala, you tried to remove her. I panicked. You ordered her mother to take her out. I needed control of the room. You tried to have the USB taken. Daniel's voice dropped. Yes. Reeves let the word sit. Did you know what was on it? No, but I knew what could be on it. At Bennett Tower, Richard joined a call with two hospital administrators. One of them, Sister Mary Catherine from St. Agnes Children's Clinic, had known Richard for years and had the tone of a woman who had comforted parents, corrected doctors, and outlived many board chairs. Richard, she said, I do not care about your enemy's press statement. I care about the equipment grant. It will be funded. Richard said, bridge payment today. Full review documentation will follow. Good. I'm sorry for the delay. You should be. Paul looked at Richard from across the table, startled by her bluntness. Richard said, I am. Sister Mary Catherine continued. And Richard, yes, sister. Do not turn that little girl into your shield. I won't. Good. God sees motives before donors do. After the call, Richard sat quietly. Paul said, she has always been direct. She has always been right. Helen, who had heard only Richard's side, looked up. Another grandmother type. Noon. Even stronger. By mid-afternoon, Detective Reeves obtained a warrant for Langford Capital's executive communications tied to Peter Vale, Daniel Cross, and Bennett Hope. By 4, Langford's attorneys were in court trying to narrow it. By 5, they failed enough for Reeves to get what mattered first. At 5:30, Helen called Richard. I need comment on Victor's statement. Richard stood near the window. Use my public statement. I need one sentence. He thought for a moment. The records will answer Mr. Lang better than I can. Helen wrote it down. Clean. Is that good? It is useful. Good as for church bulletins. That evening, Grace let Annie help heat the soup Mr. Alvarez had brought from the staff kitchen. Denise came back from work with a tired face and a bag of oranges. The apartment smelled like chicken broth, toast, and cinnamon cereal. Annie drew the staff members next. Mr. Alvarez by the Truth Plant. Detective Reeves with a badge. Helen with a notebook. Mr. Richard with toast in one hand and a blue pen in the other. Grace looked at the picture. Why does Mr. Richard have toast and a pen? So he remembers two things. What two things? To eat and to keep promises. Denise pointed at the drawing. Put that in the board minutes. Grace laughed then. A real laugh, short but needed. At Bennett Tower, Richard was still at work when Mr. Alvarez came to his office door. He held his cap in both hands. Sir, sorry to bother you. You're not bothering me. The night crew wanted me to tell you something about Mrs. Carter and Annie. Richard stood. Are they all right? Yes, sir. We just wanted to say if people come bothering them, they got more friends in this building than they know. Richard did not answer at once. Something in that simple statement reached deeper than applause ever had. Thank you, he said. Mr. Alvarez nodded. Also, Miss Annie says the plant is called the Truth Plant now. For the first time that day, Richard laughed without bitterness. Then we should take good care of it. Yes, sir. After Mr. Alvarez left, Richard walked to his desk and wrote 2 notes. One to Marcia, add night staff representation to policy review. One to himself, promises must become systems. He used blue ink. Across town, Victor Lang sat in his office. While his lead attorney explained what the warrant meant, Victor listened, expression hard, hands still. How much can they get? He asked. Enough to make silence expensive. Victor looked toward the dark glass of his window, where his own reflection stared back. For years, he had measured men by leverage. Money, access, fear, shame. He had not planned for a janitor's child, a blue pen, a hallway camera, or tired workers who remembered who treated them like furniture. His attorney continued speaking, but Victor had stopped listening. For the first time since the gala, he understood that the lie had not failed because Richard Bennett was powerful. It had failed because Annie Carter was not invisible. The warrant reached Langford Capital before sunrise. And by 9 o'clock, Victor Lang's building looked less like a firm and more like a place trying not to confess. Lawyers occupied the reception area. IT staff stood beside federal technicians with tight faces. Boxes of printed records were stacked along the conference room wall. Employees who had once carried themselves with the confidence of people paid well to know things now moved carefully, speaking only when spoken to. The glass doors still shone. The coffee bar still worked. The city view was still expensive. None of it helped. Detective Reeves arrived with 2 financial crimes investigators and a digital forensics team. She wore the same calm expression she had worn in Bennett Grand Hall, the kind that made guilty people talk too much and innocent people stand straighter. Victor Lang was waiting in the main boardroom with 3 attorneys. My company is cooperating, Victor said. Reeves looked at the row of lawyers, then at the sealed evidence bags already on the table. Your company is complying. Cooperation has a warmer sound. His lead attorney, Margaret Sloan, spoke before Victor could. Detective, all communications will go through counsel. Fine, Reeves said. Then counsel can watch us collect what the warrant covers. Victor's eyes stayed on her. You have Daniel Cross. You have Peter Vale. They are protecting themselves. People usually do. They will say whatever keeps them out of prison. Maybe, Reeves said. That's why I prefer documents. They don't get nervous. At Bennett Tower, Richard met with staff representatives in a conference room 2 floors below the executive suite. He had asked for workers from every level: security, cleaning, kitchen, reception, mail room, drivers, administrative assistants, finance, and HR. He did not sit at the head of the table. He took a chair halfway down one side next to Mr. Alvarez and across from a cafeteria worker named Brenda Hill, who had been with the company 14 years. Paul Whitaker sat beside Richard with a yellow legal pad. Marcia Bell came with policy drafts. Outside counsel came and was told by Richard to listen more than speak. Richard began plainly. I said we would turn promises into policy. I need to hear what that means from people who live under the policies. Brenda folded her hands. You sure you want that? Yes. Then don't punish people for telling the truth after asking for it. Richard nodded. That goes in writing. A security guard named Wallace Grant spoke next. Night shift has problems. Day shift never sees. People bring kids because school closes at 3 o'clock, childcare closes at 6 o'clock, and rent doesn't care. Supervisors pretend not to notice until somebody important walks through, Mr. Alvarez added. And if we report something strange from upper floors, it goes to the same managers who may be causing it, Marcia wrote quickly. Richard looked at Grace Carter's empty chair. He had invited her, but she had declined for now. Her message had been short. Annie needs quiet. Ask the workers who have been there longer. They know he respected that. What would a safe reporting line look like? Richard asked. Brenda answered. Not a company number answered by somebody's cousin in our. A few people laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was familiar, Marcia said. Independent third-party anonymous option. Written anti-retaliation policy. Direct board reporting for serious complaints, Wallace said. And night shift gets trained, too. Don't send one email at 10 a.m. and say everybody got it. Hall wrote that down. Mandatory sessions across shifts, Richard said. Paid time. Brenda looked at him. For training, yes. And child care. Richard took a breath. That is why we are here. The room waited. He continued. We will create an after-hours child care stipend and emergency care partnership. We will also set aside a safe family waiting room for unavoidable situations, staffed, logged, and separate from executive work areas. Children should not be in hallways because parents are out of options. Mr. Alvarez nodded slowly. That would matter. It should have mattered before Annie, Richard said. No one rushed to comfort him. He was grateful for that. At Grace's apartment, Annie was building a tower from cereal boxes while Grace filled out forms Linda Park had left. Denise sat on the couch reading one of the news stories on her phone and making faces at every sentence she disliked. This one says mystery child witness. Denise said, I hate that. Grace did not look up. Don't read it out loud. I'm not. I'm judging quietly. That was not quiet. Annie put a box of oatmeal on top of 2 cereal boxes. Mystery means they don't know me. Grace looked over. It means they don't need to. Good. Denise lowered the phone. You sure you don't want to go stay with me a few days? Grace shook her head. Running makes it feel like we did something wrong. Resting isn't running. I know, but Annie finally slept last night. Annie placed a cracker box on the tower. It leaned, then fell. She sighed. Buildings are hard. Grace smiled. Yes, they are. The phone rang. Detective Reeves, Grace answered. Hello, Mrs. Carter. I want you to know we're executing warrants at Langford Capitol today. Your name and Annie's name are not in the public filings. Thank you. Any new calls? Reporters. One man left a message saying he was a documentary producer. Denise told him to lose the number from the couch. Denise said, I used nicer words than that. Grace covered the phone. No, you did not. Reeves said, I heard enough to approve. Grace let out a small breath. Will Victor Lang come after us? Not directly if he has sense, but wealthy men under pressure sometimes use other people. Keep sending me any messages that feel wrong. I will. How is Annie? Grace watched her daughter rebuild the box tower. Trying to make buildings stand. Tell her that takes engineers and inspections. Grace smiled. I'll tell her. At Langford Capitol, the first useful document appeared in a calendar archive. A meeting invite from Victor Lang to Peter Vale. Subject line BHF transition strategy date 2 weeks before the gala. Attached were talking points, a media contact list, and a file titled Board Shock Path. Reeves read the title twice. Board Shock Path. One of the forensic analysts shook his head. They really named it that. Margaret Sloan, Victor's attorney, stepped closer. Detective, internal strategy language can be misinterpreted. Reeves looked up. Then your client should have named his files more innocently. Another analyst found a draft statement Victor had edited personally. The track changes showed a sentence added by V. Lang. Bennett must be framed as morally compromised before legal review begins. Reeves turned the laptop toward Margaret Sloane. How would you like me to interpret that? Sloane read it and said nothing. Victor, watching from the end of the table, finally lost some color. At Bennett Tower, the staff meeting had moved from problems to practical changes. A receptionist proposed a rotating employee council with representatives from each shift. A driver asked for clearer rules around executive errands and confidential packages. A kitchen worker asked whether contract employees would be included or left outside the policy because their badges were a different color. Richard looked at outside counsel. Counsel said carefully, "There are legal distinctions." Brenda Hill leaned back. "There always are when the check gets smaller." Richard looked at counsel. "Find a legal way to include them." Counsel nodded. "We can explore options." No draft options. Hall wrote that down. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it ended, no one clapped. People gathered their coats, coffee cups, notes, and cautious hope. Richard preferred that to applause. Applause ended quickly. Cautious hope watched what happened next. Mr. Alvarez lingered by the door. "Mr. Bennett," he said about the plant. Richard blinked. "The Truth Plant." "Yes, sir. Night crew thinks maybe don't put a plaque. Too much attention." Richard smiled. Grace said no plaques. "Smart woman." "Yes, but maybe move it a little." Mr. Alvarez said not away. "Just where nobody trips over the rocks." Richard laughed softly. "Do what you think is right." Mr. Alvarez nodded, pleased by the trust. At the police station, Peter Vale was brought in again after the Langford files were collected. His attorney looked less confident than before. Reeves placed the track change document on the table. "Victor wrote that sentence," she said. Peter read it, then nodded. "Yes. Were you in the room?" "Yes." "What did he mean by morally compromised?" Peter rubbed his face. He said, if Bennett looked greedy, no one would defend him fast enough. He said, charity people panic when children are involved. Reeves kept her tone flat. He used children as leverage. Peter's voice dropped. "Yes. Who suggested using Grace Carter's employment status if Annie interfered?" Peter looked confused. "I didn't know about Annie until after the gala. Daniel threatened Grace in the ballroom." "That would have been Daniel." Victor told him staff were pressure points. Reeves stared at him. "Pressure points." Peter nodded. By late afternoon, Reeves called Richard again. "We found tracked changes. Victor's name is in the metadata. His language is ugly." Richard stood in the hallway outside the new family waiting room space he had just toured. It had once been a storage room with broken chairs and old marketing banners. Soon, if he kept his word, it would have warm lights, clean chairs, a check-in desk, cameras for safety, books, and rules that protected workers instead of embarrassing them. "Is it enough?" he asked. "It is becoming enough. I'm learning to dislike that phrase." "Good. It means you're paying attention." Richard looked into the empty room. "Detective, did they plan to use Grace against Annie?" Daniel did in the moment. Victor's team referred to staff as pressure points. Richard's jaw tightened. "Pressure points. Stym. I am calm. You're a rich man. Calm. That can become expensive." He exhaled. "What can I do?" "Keep records. Protect your staff. Don't call Victor." "I won't." After the call, Richard asked facilities to begin clearing the room. That evening, Grace received an email from Bennett HR with the subject line "Proposed After-Hours Family Support Policy." She read it slowly. It mentioned employee representatives, paid training, child care stipends, anonymous reporting, anti-retaliation protections, and contract staff inclusion under review. Denise read over her shoulder. "Under review means maybe." Grace nodded. Then we watched the maybe. Annie sat beside them coloring. "What's maybe?" Grace said something grown-ups say when they haven't finished being brave. Annie selected the blue crayon. then right it blew. At Langford Capital, Victor sat alone after his lawyers left him for a private conference. Through the glass wall, he saw investigators boxing copies of his plans. Board shock path, emergency stewardship, moral compromise. Real enough for panic. They had all sounded sharp in strategy meetings. Now they looked plain on evidence labels. His phone was gone. His files were no longer his. Peter had talked. Daniel had talked. Metadata had talked. A child had talked. Victor looked at the empty chair across from him and understood that the room had changed shape. For years, he had believed power meant controlling what people saw. He had not understood that people who were ignored often saw everything. By the fourth day, the case had stopped being a scandal and had become a map. Detective Reeves spread that map across a conference table in the Financial Crimes Unit. Daniel Cross at Bennett Tower, Peter Vale at the service door. Victor Lang and his office editing language meant to destroy Richard Bennett before anyone could examine it. There were arrows now: dates, access logs, phone records, calendar invites, draft statements. The lie had once looked like a storm. On paper, it looked like a route. Assistant State's Attorney Nolan Price stood beside the board, coffee in one hand, marker in the other. We can charge Daniel and Vale now. Victor will fight harder. Victor has more money. Reeves said he also has more lawyers. Lawyers don't erase metadata. They slow it down. Reeves looked at the printed line from Victor's tracked changes. Bennett must be framed as morally compromised before legal review begins. Then we don't give them only metadata, she said. We give them motive, we give them plan, we give them execution, and we keep the child out of the center. Nolan nodded. Annie Carter stays supporting witness, not headline witness. She saw the handoff. The rest is adults, documents, and greed. At Bennett Tower, Richard sat alone in the small storage room that facilities had begun clearing for the new family waiting space. The old marketing banners were gone. The broken chairs were stacked by the door. Someone had brought in a folding table and a box of donated children's books from the communications department. The room still smelled faintly of cardboard and dust, but Richard could already imagine it changed. A check-in desk, warm lamps, a shelf of books, a small refrigerator, security cameras pointed for safety, not suspicion. Grace's sentence stayed with him. Don't make it charity, make it policy. Paul Whitaker knocked on the open door. I thought I'd find you upstairs. Richard picked up a thin picture book from the box. I spent too many years upstairs. Paul stepped inside and looked around. Facility says they can have a temporary version ready in a week. Not temporary, Richard said. I mean the first stage. Richard nodded. Good. Paul sat on one of the old chairs, testing it before trusting it. The board wants to discuss your role. Richard closed the book. My resignation. Some will raise it. Charles will raise it carefully. Others will ask whether you should step back during the review. Richard leaned back against the table. What do you think? Paul took off his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief. 4 days ago, I thought stepping back was necessary. Then a child stopped us from making a clean mistake. Now I think the foundation needs a review, not a sacrifice made for appearances. That sounds supportive. It is, but support is not a blank check. Richard looked at him. Nor should it be. Paul put his glasses back on. You will need to accept limits. Independent oversight, board access to systems, compliance. Authority that does not run through your office. Yes, you say that quickly. I learned slowly. Paul studied him, then gave a tired smile. That may be the truest thing you've said all week. Across town, Grace took Annie to school for the first time since the gala. She had considered keeping her home longer, but Annie had asked twice to see her teacher and once to return a library book about frogs. Grace decided frogs were a sign of health. At the school entrance, Principal Karen Lewis met them outside before they reached the office. She was in her late 50s with silver-threaded hair pulled back and the posture of someone who had separated fights, comforted parents, and balanced budgets that never stretched far enough. Good morning, Mrs. Carter, she said. Good morning, Annie. Annie held Grace's hand. "Good morning, Principal Lewis. We're glad to see you." Grace kept her voice low. "I don't want her questioned. She won't be. I spoke with her teacher. If children ask, the teacher will redirect. If adults ask, they will answer to me." Grace believed her, not because the words were big, but because the woman said them like a policy already enforced. Annie looked up. "Can I still return my frog book?" Principal Lewis smiled. "The library would be disappointed if you didn't." Grace crouched in front of Annie. "Remember what we practiced?" Annie nodded. "I told the truth, and the grown-ups are handling the rest." "That's right." Annie hugged her quick and tight, then walked inside with Principal Lewis. Grace watched until the door closed. Her hands felt empty. A reporter across the street stepped from a parked car. Grace saw the phone first, then the face. "Mrs. Carter, just one question about your daughter." Grace turned toward him. "No, it will only take a second." Principal Lewis opened the school door again before Grace could speak. "Sir, you are standing near a school entrance attempting to question a parent about a minor. Move along. I'm on public property and I am calling the district office and the police liaison. You can explain public property to them." The reporter hesitated then retreated toward the car. Grace looked at the principal. "Thank you." Principal Lewis nodded. Children should not have to become public property because adults failed privately. Grace carried that sentence with her all the way home. At noon, Richard faced the board. This meeting was larger than the first. Emergency Governance Council attended. So did the independent review lead, a former federal examiner named Thomas Greer, who spoke rarely and wrote everything down. Charles Denby sat 3 chairs from Richard, his file aligned neatly with the table edge. Hall opened. "We are here to discuss interim governance during the investigation and forensic review." Charles waited exactly 10 seconds before speaking. For the sake of the foundation, Richard should voluntarily step aside until the review is complete. Richard did not respond at once. Marcia Bell looked up sharply. "The review has already confirmed he did not authorize the transfers. It has confirmed those transfer documents were not genuine." Charles said the public distinction may not matter. Helen was not in this meeting. Richard almost wished she were. Charles spoke the language of men who feared headlines more than harm. Richard folded his hands. "What is your concern, Charles? Public trust or board control?" Charles stiffened. "That is unfair, is it?" Hall interrupted. "Let's keep this useful." Thomas Greer spoke for the first time from an independent review standpoint. "Mr. Bennett remaining in place is workable only if control changes are real. That means compliance access independent of him. Finance approvals requiring dual review and the review team reporting to the full board, not his office." Richard said, "I agree." Charles looked surprised. "You agree to all of that?" "Yes." "Then what authority remains with you?" "The authority to make sure grants continue, employees are protected, and the foundation does not freeze itself into uselessness," Marcia added. "Operational continuity matters. The clinics and schools cannot wait for our reputational comfort." Charles leaned back. "Everyone keeps saying clinics and schools as if governance is cold-hearted." Richard looked at him. "Governance without children in mind is just paperwork protecting itself." The room quieted. Hall called for a vote on interim oversight. Richard would remain as foundation chair during the review with limited unilateral authority, independent compliance reporting, emergency grant oversight, and weekly public updates on review progress. Charles voted no. The motion passed. At the police station, Daniel Cross signed the first page of his cooperation agreement. His attorney tapped the line where Daniel had to acknowledge that any lie would void the deal. Daniel read it twice. Nolan Price said, "If you minimize Victor's role, this falls apart for you." Daniel looked at him. "Victor wrote the plan. Say it cleanly." "Victor wrote the plan." Daniel repeated. "I gave him the files. Peter built the media packet. Victor approved the fake transfers for public release. Reeves watched his face and the charity money. The goal was not to move it out immediately. The goal was to force Richard out. Trigger donor panic, then create a management crisis. Langford would step in. After that, Money could be redirected legally enough to look clean. Legally enough, Reeves said. Daniel gave a humorless smile. That was Victor's favorite phrase. By late afternoon, Helen had enough for her third story, but she held it. Frank came to her desk twice. The city is waiting, he said. The court filings will land tomorrow. So I publish after the filings, not before. Then Victor can't say I poisoned the process. Frank said, you're no fun. I'm accurate. Fun retires early. Helen looked at the paragraph she had written and not yet published. The plot was not merely to accuse Richard Bennett of theft. According to documents reviewed by this paper and statements provided to investigators, the plan was to create panic, force leadership change, and position Langford Capital as the solution to the crisis it helped manufacture. She saved the draft. That evening, Annie came home with a frog sticker from the library and a note from her teacher saying she had a good day. Grace put the note on the refrigerator beside Richard's signed letter. Annie pointed. That paper is blue. The signature is because paper remembers. Grace smiled. Yes. Do people remember too? Some do. Mr. Daniel remembered wrong. Grace sat beside her. No, baby. Mr. Daniel remembered what was right. He chose wrong anyway. Annie thought about that longer than Grace expected. Is choosing wrong worse than forgetting? Most times, yes. At Bennett Tower. Richard stayed late, but not alone. Marcia, Hall, and the review team worked in the next room. Downstairs, the night crew started their shift. Mr. Alvarez had moved the truth plant a few feet away from the elevator, where no one would trip over the white stones. Richard went down to see it before leaving. Someone had watered it. Someone had wiped the leaves. No plaque. Grace would have approved. He stood there for a moment, thinking of the first night he saw Grace and Annie at the hospital, and of all the times after that when he had mistaken a kind act for a completed duty. Giving them a room had mattered, but it had not fixed the system that made the room necessary. Helping one child had mattered, but it had not excused failing to hear the workers who saw danger before he did. His phone buzzed. A message from Paul. Court filings. Expected tomorrow. Sleep if you remember how. Richard typed back. After one more thing. He opened a blank note and wrote the first line of a policy memo in blue ink on paper before sending anything digital. The Annie Carter Family Support Policy will apply to all employees and contracted staff, including night shift workers, custodial teams, drivers, kitchen staff, security personnel, and administrative support. He stopped there. The name might be too much. Grace might object. Annie deserved privacy more than tribute. He crossed out Annie Carter and wrote, Employee Family Support Policy. Then below it in smaller letters only he would see. He wrote because Annie spoke the next morning would bring filings, headlines, and Victor Lang's first real fall. But that night in the service corridor where the lie had dropped a silver USB beside a plant, Richard Bennett finally began writing something that was not a check. It was a promise with rules attached. This story reminds us that truth does not always come from the loudest person in the room. Sometimes it comes from someone small, overlooked, and easy to dismiss. Annie did not understand money, power, or corporate politics, but she understood kindness, lies, and the difference between right and wrong. Her courage shows that no act of goodness is ever wasted because the people we help today may become the ones who stand for us tomorrow. The story also teaches that justice is not only about exposing the guilty. It is about protecting the innocent, listening to the powerless, and turning promises into real actions that make life better for others. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration.